the birthplace and parents of Saint Rita. Jaka. Purinna is the name of a small village, DJL, or rather hamlet, about 3 miles from Cascia. It is situated near a small river, in a small valley, at the foot of a high cliff, which, separated from the adjoining mountains, has the appearance of a perfectly formed pine cone. There is a tradition that at the time of our Lord's deed H on the hill of Calvary, an earthquake split the rocks of the mountains in the neighborhood of Cascia, and that this particular cliff remained completely detached from the mountains. On account of its rocky site, Purinna is called Rocca Purinna. In this small village there lived, about the year 1309, a pious couple who, having plighted their troth at the foot of God's holy altar, consecrated every day of their wedded life to the service of God, and to the practice of those virtues which are most pleasing to God. The names of that worthy couple were Antonio Mancini and Amata Ferri. Antonio was a native of Rocca Purinna. Amata was born at Fogliano, a pretty hamlet, a short distance from Cascia. Though possessing little of the world's riches, Antonio Mancini earned more than enough, as a tiller of the soil, to enable himself and his good wife to live comfortably. Content with their humble lot, the happy couple felt no poverty, nor did they desire riches, and they gladly distributed to the poor and needy all they did not need for their own support and maintenance. Naturally, such generosity, on the part of Antonio and Amata, endeared them to the poor. The lips of many blessed them, and God, who rewards those who help his needy poor, showered his choicest spiritual blessings upon them. Not only were Antonio and his pious wife generous to the poor and needy, but they were, in very fact, apostles placed by God in Rocca Purinna, and like apostles they endeavored to teach their neighbors by word and example that the only way to save their souls, that the only way to heaven was by fearing and loving God, as well as by avoiding and shunning sin and vice. The examples of the holy lives of Antonio and Amata, the peace and happiness that reigned in their humble home, and the gladness and joy that were ever pictured on their countenances won many, first, to admire and respect them, and then to imitate their holy manner of living. Truly may we say that the little vine-clad cottage of Rocca Purinna, the humble home of Antonio Mancini and Amata Ferri, must have been a holy and a heavenly home, and were the world blessed with more. Such homes, the world would also be blessed with more than one saint. Rita. The true story of the apostolic work of the parents of Saint Rita is known to God alone. Nevertheless, one of its chapters has been handed down to us by zealous and trustworthy chroniclers of the Order of Saint Augustine. These chroniclers relate that the home of Saint Rita's parents was truly a house of prayer, a sanctuary of holiness, and that their lives were in perfect conformity to the commandments of God and the Church. They meditated morning and night on the Passion of Jesus Christ, and both had a heartfelt devotion to the ever-blessed Virgin Mary, the Immaculate Mother of God. Antonio and Amata were known for miles around Rocca Purinna for their kindness and cheerfulness. Everywhere they went, they cast the radiance of their benevolence and soothed many an aching heart. In matters of confidence, they vied even with the parish priest. Through their gentle influence, family dissentients were healed, and through their prudent advice, many indifferent souls were led back to the friendship of God. Filled with the Spirit and grace of God, there was born in the hearts of Antonio Mancini and Amata Ferri the apostolic zeal of saving souls. They hated it and detested sin, but loved the sinner. Hence, whenever occasion required it, they discovered a way to approach those who were guilty of grievous sins without embarrassing or offending them. They reproved them with kindness and continued their gentle reproof until even the most hardened sinners were moved and learned to hate and be sorry for their sins and hastened to be reconciled with God in the tribunal of penance. Many times when the parents of Saint Rita happened to be in the company of some of their neighbors who, not satisfied with their lot in life, would begin to murmur against the providence of God, the pious couple would adroitly change the topic of conversation and speak so feelingly of the Passion of Jesus Christ that their listeners would actually forget their trials and afflictions and feel ashamed that they had not been willing to suffer a little for him, who suffered so much for them. Again, when malice, aided by calumny, had kindled the fires of discord and was fanning the flames of revenge in the hearts of individuals and families, it was then that Antonio Mancini and Amata Ferri employed a holy diplomacy that must have been inspired by heaven. They silenced the voice of calumny disarmed the desire of revenge, restored harmony among enemies, and even transformed enemies into ardent friends. Such apostolic zeal, such gentleness in reproving sinners, such holy tact in banishing enmity and in settling quarrels and disputes, won for the parents of Saint Rita the title Peacemakers of Jesus Christ. In Rocca Perenna there existed the custom of appointing every year a man and woman whose office or function was to settle the disputes and contentions that happened to arise among the inhabitants. This appointment was made on the first Sunday of Lent in the parish church and by the parish priest, who was always very careful to make a prudent appointment. On account of their spotless reputation and well-deserved popularity, it was very natural that Antonio Mancini and his wife Amata were repeatedly appointed the peacemakers of Rocca Perenna, and biographers tell us that their judgments were always accepted as if they were the judgments of God. Living in the midst of a holy peace and happiness, the fruits of a truly Christian life, there was one joy lacking to the home of Antonio and his spouse. God had sent no child to bless their marriage, and though they had prayed often and fervently for this blessing, God seemed to be deaf to their prayers. Disappointed, as they naturally were, because their prayers were not answered, they still kept on praying, and even when they had become advanced in years, they redoubled their prayers, so great were their hope and confidence in God. God rewarded their hope and confidence and bestowed on Amata Mancini the same favor he had bestowed on Anna, the mother of Samuel, and on Elizabeth, the mother of Saint John the Baptist. One night, while Amata was praying in her humble home, an angel appeared to her in a vision and told her that it was the will of God that there would be born of her a daughter who would be, from her very birth, marked with the seal of sanctity, gifted with every virtue, and that she was to be a helper of the helpless, an advocate of the afflicted, and a guiding star in the firmament of the church. Amata was consoled and made happy by the words of the angel, and when she told the glad news to her husband Antonio, both joined a heartfelt prayer of thanksgiving to God, who was pleased to bless their old age with such a signal favor. St. Rita's birth, gilled with unspeakable joy and gladness, that God had deigned to look upon her with mercy. From the evening the angel made known to Amata Mancini that she had found grace with God and was to become a mother. Both she and her husband Antonio spent their days, and the greater part of their nights, in close communication with God, awaiting the happy event. At length the time came when the little hamlet of Rocca Perenna, the least, indeed, of all the hamlets of Umbria, was to become famous as the birthplace of a child who, in after years, was to be known and venerated as a great saint and servant of God. The biographers of Saint Rita give the day, date, and year of her birth as Saturday, May 22nd, in the year of our Lord 1381, during the pontificate of Pope Urban VI. Words cannot describe the indescribable joy of Antonio and Amata, as with loving eyes they gazed on their little daughter, whom they considered a precious gift of God, the fruit of their desires, and the reward of their long years of hope and confidence in God. The unexpected news that Amata Mancini had become a mother in bare old age was the cause of much surprise, talk, and gossip among the inhabitants of Rocca Perenna. All considered the event as truly miraculous. Every man, woman, and grown-up child of the little hamlet went to offer congratulations to the happy and overjoyed parents, and all who gazed on the smiling face of the newborn babe were charmed by the radiance of the little one's wonderful beauty. A few days after the happy delivery of Amata, she desired that her little daughter be baptized, and both parents began to consider what name to give her. While pondering over the choice of a name, God made known to the pious parents that it was His wish that their babe should be named Rita. Accordingly, on the fourth day after her birth, the child of Antonio Mancini and Amata Ferri was baptized in St. Mary's, the parish church of Cascia, there being, at that time, no Baptist malfont in the church at Rocca Perenna. As was commanded by God, the little babe was baptized Rita, a name till then unknown to the world. But since that time the sweet name of Rita has been given to many Catholic babes, when they are made children of God and heirs of the kingdom of heaven, but by the regenerating waters of the sacrament of baptism. Some authors, who have written the life of our saint, claim that she received, at her baptism, the name of Margarita, and that Rita is a contraction of Margarita. But though we know that the practice of contracting or syncopating names, and especially the names of women, is very common in Italy, we follow the opinion of the learned Augustinian writer, Didacus, who tells us that the child of Antonio Mancini and Amata Ferri was baptized Rita. And furthermore, we read in the decree of the canonization of our saint that it was announced to Amata, in a vision, that she should call her child Rita. Shortly after Rita had been regenerated by the saving waters of baptism, God attested, by a singular prodigy, that her name was not of human invention, but rather of heavenly origin. The day after her baptism, the 5th after her birth, a swarm of bees, white as the driven snow, was noticed hovering and buzzing around the sweet angelic face of the little Rita, as she lay quietly sleeping in her cradle. The bees alighted on her lips and were seen to enter and issue forth from her partially opened mouth without harming her or causing her to awaken from her slumber. All who were witnesses of this singular prodigy recognized that it implied a mystery, though they could not understand or fathom its meaning. In after years, Rita herself made known the meaning of the mystery by the singular sweetness and simplicity of her manner and by the eminent sanctity of her marvelous life, of which the swarm of white bees that buzzed around the cradle of her infancy was a happy presage. The bees were also a mysterious presage of Rita's future beatification that was to take place when the bees of urban VI reigned in the church. Concerning these mysterious bees we must observe. The prodigy, after 4 centuries, still exists in the small stubby arm of bees that now dwell in a small fissure in the convent wall, midway between the cell Saint Rita occupied in the place of her sepulchre. Their color is not white, as some authors have said, confounding these bees with those that appeared at her cradle. Their color is that of the common bee, except the back, which is a dark red, and they have no sting. They live retired the greater part of the year, but they leave their tiny abode during the last few days of Holy Week and return for the feast of Saint Rita. On one occasion, one of these bees was sent to urban VI enclosed in a glass vase. It remained, however, but one day in the Pope's palace and returned at once to its companions in Cascia. We will close this chapter by saying Catholic mothers have rocked the cradles of many remarkable babes, but none more remarkable than that of our little sister Rita of Rocca Perenna. The early years of Saint Rita. Innocence and purity are her sister virtues, or at least they are inseparable companions. Where innocence is, there also is purity. In fact, innocence and purity are so intimately associated that they appear to be one and the same virtue. Though natural to infancy, the exercise of these two virtues is the effect of divine grace. Guided by the wisdom from above, Antonio Mancini and Amata Ferri, the pious parents of Saint Rita, watched with loving and jealous care over every day of her infancy, for they regarded their little babe as a gift from heaven, the fruit of a special grace, and the child of God rather than of man. Hence we may safely say, without any fear of exaggeration, that little Rita Mancini began to be a saint and to live a supernatural life from the very moment of her baptism, when her soul was made beautiful by divine grace. And that the virtues of innocence and purity were deeply rooted in her pure soul, for scarcely had she come to use of reason, than she became the possessor of an innocence and a purity which were really marvelous in one of so tender an age. These two virtues were mirrored on her angelic face. Her every word exhaled an odor of sweetness, and possessed a mysterious power which inclined the soul to God, while her every act bespoke the guidance of a power far above the human. Little Rita was indeed, so to speak, a precious plant, planted, as it were, by the hands of God in his vineyard, and with loving care did God cause the dews of heavenly grace to fall gently on that tender plant, which was to become in later years, and we may say for all years, a towering cedar of his glory and omnipotence. Clothed, therefore, as our little sister was, with the double cloak of innocence and purity, her guardian angel, who was ever by her side, took her by the hand and led his little companion along the most prudent paths, nor did God permit her to perform any act or entertain any thought, but those compatible with his holy will and service. It is not, therefore, a matter of surprise that the little servant of God differed from other children in her early years, for at the age when most children are accused to enjoy and amuse themselves with dolls and other playthings, little Rita Mancini found no pleasure mysteries, particularly the Passion of Jesus Christ, a devotion she had inherited from her pious parents. We must not judge from little Rita's dislike to be clad in pretty frocks and dresses that she was at times willful and disobedient. On the contrary, she was a most obedient child. She loved dearly her aged parents, and many a time did she kneel at her mother's knees. listening to her holy counsels, after the manner of the little Immaculate Mary of Nazareth at the knees of her mother saint, Anne. Hence what may have seemed disobedience on the part of little Rita were in fact mild reproofs, prompted, no doubt, by God against that vanity which, alas, too often is planted by indulgent parents in the hearts of their young children. One of little Rita's chief delights was to go to church with her parents, and when she entered the house of God, she sought the most retired place, where she recited with devotion the angelical salutation which she knew by heart, and then, as if God had given his little servant a clear understanding of the incarnation of our Lord, she would close her eyes and give her whole soul to a deep contemplation of this great mystery. Oftentimes, while assisting at the holy sacrifice of the Mass, her face would change its expression. Sometimes it bore the expression of glad joy, and at other times, her face would indicate that she was experiencing moments of sadness. These alternate expressions of gladness and sadness plainly told how glad she was to be in the house of God, kneeling in the presence of Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament, and how sad she became at the very thought that her innocent Jesus was obliged to die an ignominious death on the wood of the cross. Oh, would that we, who assist so often at the holy sacrifice of thee, in child games or child toys. You must not think, however, that little Rita did not associate with children of her own age. On the contrary, she had scores of little friends among the children of Rocca Perenna, and though she did not, as a rule, engage in their games, nevertheless, she took pleasure in seeing her little friends enjoy themselves. Even when she grew larger, instead of desiring to be present at picnics or parties where little girls experience great joy in being admired and petted by relatives and friends, the little Rita preferred solitude to these mirthful gatherings. And many a time when her loving mother wished to dress her, according to the fashion of the day, she would hie to a remote corner of the house to pray and contemplate the divine mysteries, particularly the Passion of Jesus Christ, a devotion she had inherited from her pious parents. We must not judge from little Rita's dislike to be clad in pretty frocks and dresses that she was at times willful and disobedient. On the contrary, she was a most obedient child. She loved dearly her aged parents, and many a time did she kneel at her mother's knees, listening to her holy counsels, after the manner of the little Immaculate Mary of Nazareth at the knees of her mother saint, Anne. Hence what may have seemed disobedience on the part of little Rita were in fact mild reproofs, prompted, no doubt, by God against that vanity which, alas, too often is planted by indulgent parents in the hearts of their young children. One of little Rita's chief delights was to go to church with her parents, and when she entered the house of God, she sought the most retired place, where she recited with devotion the angelical salutation which she knew by heart, and then, as if God had given his little servant a clear understanding of the incarnation of our Lord, she would close her eyes and give her whole soul to a deep contemplation of this great mystery. Oftentimes, while assisting at the holy sacrifice of the Mass, her face would change its expression. Sometimes it bore the expression of glad joy, and at other times, her face would indicate that she was experiencing moments of sadness. These alternate expressions of gladness and sadness plainly told how glad she was to be in the house of God, kneeling in the presence of Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament, and how sad she became at the very thought that her innocent Jesus was obliged to die an ignominious death on the wood of the cross. Oh, would that we, who assist so often at the holy sacrifice of the Mass, could experience, in our hearts and souls, the same spiritual joy and sadness. We must also observe that little Rita had a great Jove and affection for the poor. At table, whenever her mother put on her plate a portion of the family meal, one portion she ate herself, the other portion she pre-served to give to some poor child of the neighborhood. This practice was habitual with the little Rita, and it is right she felt more happiness in giving away a portion of her meals than in eating what she retained for herself. The people of Rocca Perenna, when they saw how different Rita Mancini was from the other children of the hamlet, and when they observed that as she grew in years, her life became more holy and sacramental, they respected and revered her, not indeed as a child, but rather as a person grown old in virtue. Especially were the mothers of Rocca Perenna edified by her holy and exemplary child life, and they were continually telling their little daughters to take Rita Mancini as their model. The fame of little Rita's holy life was not limited to the narrow zone of Rocca Perenna. It became known and was spoken of in many of the towns and villages of Umbria, but especially did the inhabitants of her humble birthplace rejoice. for they were beginning to see realized what was predicted at her cradle by the swarm of white bees, which like flakes of snow, entered and issued from her sweet mouth for the child life of Saint. Rita was so celestial that she appeared to be a little angel living in the world, yet immune from all its imperfection and corruption. St. Rita begins to live a ID or retirement and desires ardently to consecrate her virginity to God. On is indeed wonderful in Ida's saints and a careful study of the life of Saint Rita of Cascia, from her cradle to the grave, will convince anyone of this beautiful and holy truth. Already a model of innocence and purity, and though as yet but a child, it was Rita's ardent desire to live a solitary life in some hidden cave or grotto where she might pass her days uninterrupted in prayer and contemplation, because she coveted to be alone with God. Filial love, however, and the obedience due her aged parents, whom she felt would oppose this, hindered the execution of her holy desire. Not a little disappointed, but by no means discouraged, she wavered not in her determination to live in retirement, so that she might be as near as possible to God. How to sustain this determinal ion, and at the same time be submissive to her parents, was for Rita a perplexing problem. Her perplexity, however, was of short duration. God, who must have regarded with rapture the pure and innocent heart of his young servant, inspired her to build a small but pretty oratory in a retired part of her home, where she remained for 1 whole year, separated from all commerce with the world, unless we except her parents, to whom she spoke only when necessary. During that year of solitude, Rita spent her time meditating on the sorrowful mysteries of the Passion of Jesus Christ. And as a help to her meditation, she had painted on the walls of her little oratory some scenes of the life of Christ, such as the crib wherein the infant Jesus was laid after his birth, Mount Calvary, the theater of his death on the cross, and the sepulchre, wherein his sacred body was placed after it had been taken down from the cross. It is also probable that a picture of the Blessed Mother of Jesus ornamented the walls of her oratory. Gazing at those pictures, she experienced no distractions in her prayers or meditations, but true as the steel to the magnet, her heart and soul were so attracted by Jesus Christ that she desired nothing more than to have and possess the love and grace of her crucified Lord. At the conclusion of that year spent, for the most part, in constant prayer and commerce with God and his mother, Rita saw that her parents needed her constant aid and assistance, especially her mother. Antonio Mancini, once robust and vigorous, had become so feeble that it was with great difficulty he cultivated a small garden, which supplied his frugal table with vegetables, and his faithful wife Amata, whose age had debilitated and sapped her strength, could only perform a small part of the ordinary household duties. Rita, who understood thoroughly the obligations of children towards their parents, judged it to be the will of God that she should give up her retired life, so that it might not be, in any way, a hindrance to her duty towards her aged father and mother. Accordingly, Rita came forth from the retreat, where she had spent so many days and nights with God, and became, to the great joy of her parents, the housekeeper, so to speak, of her humble home. How well Rita performed the duties of housekeeper we may surmise, and it must have pleased her parents, especially her mother, to see how industrious and painstaking their little daughter was, as like an angel in human form, she busied herself while at work. But though Rita was most assiduous about her work, it never seemed to interfere or interrupt her prayer. Notwithstanding her extreme attention to her exterior employments, she acquired a wonderful facility of joining them with mental prayer, and of keeping herself constantly in the presence of God, who, no doubt, aided his little handmaid with her work, and guided her little hands to make and keep the humble home of her parents a model of order and neatness. Would that the children of the present day loved and obeyed their parents as did little Rita Mancini. Then would be silenced forever that complaint of so many fathers and mothers, "I have lost control of my children." Having spent a few years employed in the duties of housekeeper, Rita arrived at that age when young girls, especially in Italy, are accustomed to choose their future state in life. From the Augustinian breviary we learn that Rita Mancini was 12 years of age when she made her choice. She consulted no one but God, and as it was her one desire to consecrate her virginity to God, so that she might better preserve the candor of her soul, of which the white bees that hovered around her cradle were the heralds, she determined to be a true spouse of Christ, by embracing a religious life and become a nun. But alas, many years were to pass before Rita's aspirations were fulfilled, For by the permission of God, it was only after being tried in the crucible of afflictions and contradictions that she found, at last, that happiness for which her heart yearned from the time she was but a child. Having resolved to become a spouse of Jesus Christ and to dedicate herself wholly to his service, Rita's first thought, as became an obedient daughter, was to make known her determination to her parents and obtain their permission. Accordingly, one evening, when her father and mother were talking together, Rita, who had been an attentive listener to their pious and holy conversation, waited until they finished. She then kissed them both reverently and told them that she had made up her mind to become a nun. Antonio Mancini and Amata Ferri were overcome with surprise, and their old and wrinkled countenances became clouded with sadness at what their young daughter had told them. And as she continued, with humility and with an eloquence that was more than human, to plead for their permission, every word that Rita uttered pierced, like sharp arrows, the hearts of her parents and even brought tears to their eyes. And yet, because Rita loved her parents and would not do anything to cause them the least sorrow or pain, there were included in her holy plea the words of submission and resignation: "Not my will, dear parents, but thine be done." The silence that followed Rita's earnest plea for her parents' permission to permit her to embrace the religious state caused her to divine that her parents had just reasons for not granting her desire. At length, when her parents could no longer hide their sorrow, they broke silence, and, betwixt sobs and sighs, spoke feelingly to Rita. They reminded her that they were already advanced in years, that she was their only child, and, after God, their solace, comfort, and support, and finally they said that through her, they hoped to see their family saved from extinction. The tears and pleading of Antonio and Amata were not fruitless. Hitherto Rita had never disobeyed her parents. In fact, it had been her custom to anticipate their wishes. But on this occasion, no one but God will ever know how much, and what it cost Rita Mancini when she told her parents that she would obey their will and remain at home to comfort and assist their old age. Nevertheless, though love and obedience prevented Rita from embracing the religious state, she was firmly determined to remain a faithful spouse of her divine bridegroom, Jesus Christ, to whom, in her heart, she had pledged her fidelity. St. Rita sacrifices her will on the altar of obedience and consents to enter the marriage state. We have related in the last chapter that Rita, yielding to the tears and supplications of her aged parents, promised to remain at home to comfort and assist them. Her promise, however, did not in any way weaken her determination to preserve and violate the flower of her virginity, which she already desired to consecrate to God. But seeing that there was little hope of embracing the religious state, at least while her parents lived, so inflamed was she with the love of Jesus Christ and the most glorious Virgin Mary, that she resolved never to embrace the married state. Having made this resolution, a double joy and consolation filled the heart of Rita. She could remain faithful to her divine bridegroom, and at the same time be a loving and obedient daughter. By reason of this double joy and consolation, a heavenly light illumined continually her countenance, and as she performed, day in and day out, her domestic duties, she cast a halo of happiness everywhere around her. But Rita's joy and happiness were of short duration. Either filial love and obedience were to be put to a further test, a test that was to cause in her soul a real combat between her love of God and the love of her parents. Antonio Mancini and Amata Ferri, overjoyed that their daughter had given up the idea of entering a convent, now determined that she should enter the marriage state. They had already hinted that this was their wish when they had persuaded their young daughter that she was duty-bound not to abandon them. It is certain, however, that in yielding to the entreaties of her parents not to enter a convent, it had never entered into the mind of Rita to have any spouse other than Jesus Christ. We can, therefore, imagine first the surprise and then the inexpressible anguish to which Rita became a prey when her parents told her they were going to choose a husband for her, as it was their wish that she should marry. Their age added eloquence to their words as they insisted that she should consent to their wishes. They reminded her that she had been given to them in their old age, long after they had almost given up all hope of offspring, and they emphasized that she, by her marriage, would be the cause not only of saving their family from extinction, but also of making their declining years happy and comfortable. We would indeed be tempted to condemn Antonio Mancini and his wife Amata for arrogating to themselves the right to force the vocation of their daughter, and thus making her the prey of human calculation, Did we not believe that God, in His profound and impenetrable wisdom, permitted this, so that his chosen servant Rita, after having been a model for Christian maidens, should also, like Saint Monica, become a model for Christian wives and mothers? The unexpected announcement of her parents wrung tears from the eyes of Rita and nearly broke her heart. A sort of paralysis seized her, and for some moments she could not find her voice. When the martyrdom that was taking place in her pure soul had somewhat subsided, Rita recovered the use of her tongue and firmly but with dove-like simplicity said, "My parents, I do not wish any spouse but Jesus Christ. Years ago I dedicated my whole body, heart and soul to His love and holy service. Because you wished it, I gave my promise not to enter a convent. I feel sure, with the help of God, without embracing the marriage state, that I will be able to console and comfort you and provide for all your necessities until God calls you to a better and a happier home." But Antonio and Amata, who had made up their minds that their daughter should marry, turned deaf ears to the heartfelt words of Rita, and the poor child, judging that further speech would be useless, in her desire to be alone with God, retired from the presence of her parents and hurried to the solitude and quiet of her beloved oratory. Once within its walls, she fell upon her knees and, raising her eyes with hope and confidence to the crucifix, asked her crucified Lord to relieve her of that poignant perplexity which had begun to tear her very heart. From the moment her parents told her that it was their will that she should marry, she also implored the Queen of Angels and Virgins and asked her to be so kind as to obtain for her from God the lights which were necessary for accomplishing what would prove most acceptable to His divine majesty and conducive to her soul's salvation. Expressing to her merely the ardent desire she felt of embracing on earth an angelic mode of life. Without any doubt, Rita knew it would be no sin to marry in obedience to the will of her parents, but since she felt that God had called her, even from her early years, to be His spouse, and since she bad responded generously to this summons by desiring to vow to God the jewel of her virginity, Rita now awaited on bended knee the voice and decision of God, which would tell her if she should and could obey the will of her parents without offending the will of her Jesus, whom she loved with her whole heart and soul. It is very certain that the fervent prayers which Rita offered in her little oratory were graciously heard by God, who soothed and consoled her aching and troubled heart. And we may believe that God made known to His servant Rita that she should conform and submit her will to the will of her parents, and that by so doing she would obey His holy will, without losing any of the merits already gained by the ardent desire of consecrating her virginity to Him, as the sole Lord and spouse of her heart and soul. As soon as Rita had learned that it was the will of God that she should submit to the will of her parents, and that she would please God more by her submission than by following her own will, she resolved, then and there, to obey the voice and will of God, and offer no further opposition to the will and desires of her parents. Accordingly, Rita returned to her parents, and prostrating herself at their feet, humbly asked pardon for the repugnance she had hitherto manifested to their will, and told them she was disposed and willing to embrace whatever state of life they wished her to enter. St. Rita's marriage. Antonio Mancini and Amata Ferri, happy with joy because their daughter had consented to enter the marriage state, began, at once, the search for a suitable husband for Rita. A model of children, because her childhood was most remarkable, she became the model of maidens when she stepped across the threshold that separates childhood from maidenhood. Beautiful as an angel, modest as innocence, and lovable as virtue, Rita Mancini could have had, if she wished, many suitors for her hand. All who saw her could not help being attracted by her physical beauty, and all who knew her were charmed by her native modesty, both in conduct and speech. In a word, Rita Mancini was esteemed and respected by every one with whom she came in contact. We can easily believe that among the many exemplary and industrious young men of Rocca Perenna, there were more than one who would have gladly chosen Rita as wife. But since we know that from her earliest years, her sole desire was to have no other lover but Jesus Christ, we can well understand why she had no desire to keep company with the opposite sex. But now the time had come when Rita Mancini was to enter a new state in life. She had yielded to the insistence of her aged parents and had consented to many whomsoever they would choose for her husband. That Rita's choice would have been a different and a better one than that of her parents, we have no doubt. But Rita had no voice in the matter, for Antonio Mancini and his wife Amata selected for their future son-in-law a young man whose name was Ferdinando. The early biographers of Saint Rita tell us that Ferdinando was the son of well-to-do and influential parents. He was gifted with excellent parts, but proud and haughty, surly in speech, and by no means a religious man. There is no doubt but that Ferdinando, who was the very opposite in character and disposition to the modest and gentle Rita, felt highly honored when he learned from her parents that he was the only one, among all the young men of Roccaporena, who might pay court to their daughter with the view of leading her to the altar as his bride. Ferdinando proved himself an ardent wooer, and after a short courtship, he and Rita pledged their marriage vows before the altar of God, in the presence of Jesus Christ in the Blessed Sacrament. The marriage of Ferdinando and Rita recalls to our mind the marriage of Saint Monica, the mother of the illustrious Saint Augustine. She was married under circumstances similar to those of Saint Rita, and like Saint Rita, has bequeathed to posterity a sacred name and memory, both written with letters of gold in the annals of the Catholic Church. Ferdinando and Rita spent the days of their honeymoon, as is the custom in Italy, visiting and enjoying themselves among relatives and friends. Outwardly, Rita appeared to be happy. She shook hands with all who approached to offer congratulations, and acknowledged with a sweet smile the many good wishes that were showered upon her. But her heart and soul took no part in the festivities that were going on around her, for do what she would, she could not help shedding tears at the very thought of losing that pearl of earthly happiness, which she had sought to give and consecrate solely to God. Rita had been married but a very short time, when Ferdinando began to show his true character, and Rita began to experience that her marriage was an apprenticeship to trials and sorrows. Words cannot describe the almost inhuman conduct of Ferdinando with regard to his wife Rita. When he spoke, his words were always harsh and cruel. Like the sea that is agitated by the least motion of the wind, Ferdinando flew into a passion at everything that Rita said, or at everything she did, so that instead of her companion and protector, he was in very fact her relentless persecutor. Under the weight and strain of such persecution, and we may call it martyrdom, many a young wife would have succumbed under the ordeal, but not so Rita. She suffered the unnatural treatment of her cruel husband with a surprising courage and fortitude, and aided by God, who gave her the grace of suffering, she gave a most signal example of patience and humility. Armed with these two eminent virtues, Rita set to work to perform and conquer the sullen and perverse disposition of Ferdinando. Well trained from her early years in the art of housekeeping, she helped her maids perform the household duties with the utmost care and diligence, and was most untiring in her efforts to make, as only a good wife can, the home of her husband an earthly paradise. In her endeavors to check the wild rage of his anger, she sometimes observed a strict silence, uttering not a single word. At other times she performed with humility whatever he commanded her to do, and very often answered him when forced to do so, with words of holiness and sweetness such as angels use. But alas, the ugly and morose character of Ferdinando, instead of becoming less rude and sullen, became more and more an instrument of torture to Rita's patience, a patience as praiseworthy and laudable as that of holy Job. For if God permitted that his servant Job should suffer great temporal losses, as well as the calumnies of his best friends, and even of his own wife, so that his patience might be, for all ages, a shining example, we may also say the same as regards the sufferings and patience of Saint Rita. When she plighted her troth to Ferdinando, she thought he would be both a loving husband and a kind companion. But instead, he proved himself a cruel enemy who continually mortified and tortured her. He dissipated and squandered much of his money at gaming, and though he gave Rita more than enough money for the household expenses, he was always complaining that she w as extravagant. Atherte. Bente. He insulted her time and again with injurious and scurrilous words, and sometimes, perhaps, laid violent hands upon her defenseless body. But Rita suffered all this cruel treatment with heroic patience, because it was the will of God that she should become a mirror of patience, by means of which she was the beloved of God and loved and revered by men. In closing this chapter, we may say with truth that God placed Saint Rita in his church and made her both a mirror and a flaming torch, so that married women may see in her and learn from her example how to suffer with fortitude and patience the bad conduct and cruel treatment of bad and perverse husbands. St. Rita, by her humility and patience, converts her cruel husband. Here is in the character of each of the great saints of the Augustinian order a peculiar trait or virtue that attracts, in a special manner, our attention and admiration. In Saint Augustine, we find a burning love for penance after his memorable conversion in Saint Monica. We discover a remarkable love of prayer in Saint Thomas of Villanova. We cannot help observing his extreme charity for the poor and needy in Saint Clare of Montefalco. We are moved by her great devotion to the passion of Jesus Christ. But when we come to speak of Saint Rita of Cascia, though she possessed, in an eminent degree, the virtues for which her spiritual brothers and sisters are distinguished, we must say that it is chiefly on account of her godlike love of humility and patience that she merits our unstinted respect and veneration. And we shall see in the course of this chapter that it was by reason of the exercise of these two virtues that she converted her cruel husband from his wicked ways and made her home a peaceful sanctuary of holy bliss. As we related in the last chapter, Ferdinando, the husband of Rita, did all he could by his wicked and perverse conduct to make her life miserable and unhappy. But like the valiant woman she was, she rendered him good and not evil. Mindful of the promises she made at the foot of the altar, Rita humbly obeyed her husband with extraordinary punctuality and zeal. Of a most retiring disposition, instead of visiting or gossiping with the women of the neighborhood, she remained at home, never leaving it, except to pay a visit to her aged parents or to go to Mass or Vespers. But never did she go anywhere without acquainting her husband or asking his permission. She paid much attention to the comfort of Ferdinando and took zealous care that his clothes were always scrupulously neat. The management of her household was wise and prudent, and to teach with example what she advocated with words, she clothed herself with modest raiment, not having the least desire for costly and stylish dresses or any kind of ornaments. For Rita knew well that all the beauty of the king's daughter is within. She was kind and affable to the domestics of her household, and studied to make them happy and contented with their lot. She saw that they attended their religious duties, taught them good and polite manners, and molded them into models of obedience, neatness, and propriety. So much so indeed, that her neighbors were accustomed to tell their domestics that they should take pattern from those of Rita. And it was a common saying in Rocca Pereira that as Rita Mancini had been a model of a perfect maiden, she was indeed a model of a perfect wife. What a pity, we are inclined to say, that Rita, who carried sunshine and holiness as an atmosphere, had to undergo so many trials and sufferings. And yet, in spite of those trials and sufferings, she, so to speak, by making use of the trowel of humility and the mortar of patience, laid the cornerstone and budded the foundation, on which was erected that splendid edifice of domestic peace that won the admiration and encomiums of her neighbors. We know that from the very beginning of her married life, her husband Ferdinando was an obstacle to that peace, but Rita met his opposition with the arms of humility and patience, which experience had taught her to handle with skill and precision. Whenever her husband became angry, she studied to sweeten his temper sometimes by silence, and indeed her silence was a wordless prayer that ascended to heaven, and at other times she waited until his fit of anger was over, and then she would try with sweet and holy words to reason with him and make him understand how great was his offense against God, and how little he thought of his intelligence, to allow himself to become the prey and the slave of anger and passion. This manner of acting, on the part of Rita, had a great and beneficial effect on her husband, and many a time after she had mildly upbraided him for yielding to anger and using injurious words, he would become somewhat embarrassed and actually ashamed of himself, and would rush from the house and not return until he became fully calm and recollected. As time went by, Rita observed with joy that Ferdinando was beginning to be less choleric and less cruel in his manner of speaking and acting towards her. Her humility and patience, supplemented by prayers and tears, softened his fierce and almost ungovernable temper, and God opened his eyes and made him see and understand what a cruel husband he had been to persecute and torment a wife who bore and tolerated these angry and injurious words, with the meekness of a dove, who served him with humility, who respected him when he himself had lost all respect, and who obeyed him when obedience cost her much suffering and many humiliations. Ferdinando became at length a changed man. Tai saw, as in a vision, what manner of man he had been, and was truly penitent. Lai confessed with a sorrowful heart that blinded by passion, he had been an ungrateful and cruel husband. Life frequently returned thanks to Todd for having given him as a wife so good and exemplary a woman as Rita, who by her humility and patience had led him from the paths of wickedness and disorder onto the paths of virtue and peace, thereby making him faithful to all the duties of a good husband and a devout Christian. Peace and harmony being established between Ferdinando and Rita, their household became a garden of paradise. Words of prayer and kindness were constantly on the lips of Ferdinando, instead of angry, threatening, and abusive utterances. At home, he was kindness itself, and showered every kind of loving attention on Rita, and abroad, he could not find words enough to praise her virtues and worth. On her part, Rita was extremely happy and was untiring in her thanksgiving to God for having aided in converting her husband from being a raging lion into a faithful and loving husband and as docile as a lamb. No wonder an admiring world places Saint Rita of Cascia side by side with Saint Monica as the model of Christian wives. God blesses the marriage of Saint Rita with two beautiful children. Scarcely had Rita begun to enjoy the fruits of Ferdinando's conversion, then a new sorrow came upon her. Her aged father and mother died and passed to their reward in heaven. Rita felt and mourned their death, not only because she loved them with the deepest affection, but also because she considered them her instructors who gave her the first lessons in piety and taught her to walk in the way of Christian perfection. But this sorrow was soon lessened, for God, in His mercy and goodness, sent her a great blessing that filled her heart and soul with gladness and joy. During the several unhappy years that followed the marriage of Ferdinando and Rita Mancini, years signalized by the unchristian life and cruel conduct of Ferdinando and the prayers, tears, and trials of Rita, God had not deigned to bless their union with offspring. This great blessing, however, was not to be denied to Rita, it was only delayed. God, it would seem, was waiting until she converted her husband from his evil ways and made him worthy to receive from his hands that gift which, to a married couple, is the most precious and the most welcome of all gifts, a little child. That Rita, in her hours of sadness and affliction, mourned the absence of a little one to fondle and caress, of a tiny baby mouth to kiss, of a little crib over which she could softly sing a lullaby, we are inclined to believe. But this absence never caused Rita to murmur against the will of God. On the contrary, it often prompted her to say, "Sia fatta la volontà di Dio." May the will of God be done. This short prayer of holy resignation was heard in heaven, and after Rita had established peace in her home by winning Ferdinando to a sense of his Christian duties, God sent her two beautiful children to be, as it were, and pledges that guaranteed the peace and happiness and love of both her husband and herself. The birth of their first child, who received, at the baptismal font, the name of Giovanni, naturally filled the hearts of Ferdinando and Rita with joy and gladness, and many and fervent were the thanksgiving prayers that both recited by the cradle side of their little son, whom God had sent to bless their home. Especially was Ferdinando happy, for he saw in his little son Giovanni the promise of the preservation of his family and name. A name that was an honorable one, though he himself had besmirched it time and again before he had come under the benign influence of his saintly and holy wife. As regards Rita, there was no happier mother in Rocca Perenna, and we may say in all Italy. Her heart now bestowed its love and affection impartially on her little son and his father. And, no doubt, she would have wished for no more happiness in this world were there not always before her mind the vision of a convent with its little cell, wherein she was to find a still greater happiness after she had fulfilled, according to the will of God, the honorable and sacred duties of wife and mother, with joy and happiness perfuming, so to speak, the atmosphere of her home, and the white dove of peace hovering around the hearth of Rita. We can easily fancy what a pretty picture of domestic bliss Ferdinando and Rita made, as they sat by the cradle of their little son, vying in love and affection for their Angeletto, a term of endearment they were wont to call their little Giovanni. When the little Giovanni was but a few days more than a month old, his parents carried him to the church, where they offered him to God and asked God to aid them to bring him up according to Allah's holy will. But in the designs of God's providence, a new happiness awaited the already happy Ferdinando and Rita, and in God's own time, their happiness was duplicated. Rita gave birth to a second child, who was baptized Paolo. Like his little brother Giovanni, Paolo was offered to God, and now Ferdinando and Rita had 4 little feet to guide on the path to heaven instead of 2. The education of Giovanni and Paolo began in the lap of their mother, and between kisses and caresses, the first word she taught them to pronounce was that sweetest of all sweet names, the holy name of Jesus. As Giovanni and Paolo advanced in years, Rita taught them to pray and used every method to prevent the first sallies of dangerous passions, and impressed upon their young minds the priceless value of humility and patience, those beautiful virtues, of which Rita herself was a most striking example. What a beautiful school did not Rita establish, and what an excellent course of studies did she not plan for the education of her 2 sons. Without neglecting to instruct them in profane knowledge, she paid particular attention to educate them in the science of salvation. Ferdinando aided also in the education of his sons by setting them good examples, for he had also been taught by Rita. That good example is like an inheritance given by a parent to a son, an almost infallible means of conveying the virtues of one to the other. As a result of Rita's teaching, she, who began to be a saint from the very moment of her baptism, made saints of her children. She and her husband had the happiness to see Giovanni and Paolo grow up to be young boys, truthful, obedient, and respectful, indifferent to the things of the world, with the greatest ardor for virtue, the greatest love for God, fear of his judgments, and dread of sin. What a happy and holy world it would be if there were more mothers like Saint Rita of Cascia. Rita demonstrated clearly, during the whole course of her married life, that the practice of virtue is not incompatible with the holy state of matrimony. Saint Rita did more. She practiced, to a high degree, those virtues that shine most resplendent in the higher state of life, and what is most surprising, she practiced them without experiencing the least obstacle in doing so. The secret of Saint Rita's facility in the practice of virtue was, she kept herself at all times and in all places in the grace and presence of God. She was all for God, and everything she said or did was for the honor and glory of God. Hence, the more urgent were the obligations of her state of life, the more she felt herself disposed to the practice of virtue, for she judged that she would not be sufficiently grateful for all the graces and favors he had bestowed upon her, if, besides practicing the virtues peculiar to the marriage state, she did not practice those which belonged to the higher state. Saint Rita was indeed well prepared to practice any and every virtue, for the lamp of her soul was filled with the oil of good works, after the manner of the lamps of the prudent virgins made mention of in the Gospel, and she was in no way inferior to them. The miraculous incorruptibility of her body and the sweet odor which it exhales even to this day plainly tell us that Saint Rita did not lose any of the reward that God gives to virgins, though she, by virtue of obedience to the wishes of her parents and guided by the will of God, did embrace the married state. In this chapter, we will only speak of a few of the virtues which Saint Rita practiced during her married life. To say even a few words of the many virtues she possessed would require a volume by itself. For her soul was endowed with as many virtues and clothed and decked with as many ornaments of grace as that woman of strength and beauty whose picture has been painted by the Holy Ghost, and of which picture Saint Rita is a faithful copy. Our saint was, as it were, a fragrant rose, who preserved, amidst the thorns of penance, her conjugal chastity. Although she never committed a grievous fault, she punished her innocent body with the discipline, and kept it under the complete control of the Spirit by continual fastings. Not content with observing the fast of Lent and the other fast days prescribed by Holy Mother Church, she observed 2 other Lents during the year and took only bread and water on the vigils of the feasts of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Here we must observe, though Saint Rita mortified herself most rigorously, she did it so judiciously that her husband and the other members of her household scarcely observed it. God wrought in her the same miracle he wrought in favor of the Hebrew youths at the court of Babylon, who grew more beautiful because they fasted and abstained for the more Saint Rita fasted and punished her body by penance, the more beautiful and graceful she became. But though everyone admired the marvelous beauty and grace of Saint Rita, she was more admired for the beauty of her soul, which was well known to everyone in Rocca Perenna by reason of her edifying life and on account of the numberless good works she performed. In her intercourse with her neighbors, Saint Rita was most affable, and in her conversations she never uttered a word that could in any way offend. And when she heard anyone speak ill of a neighbor, she reproved mildly the speaker, either by defending the character of the absent one or artfully changing the subject of conversation. Many were the persons who came to her for advice and consolation in their trials and troubles, and no one ever regretted their coming. And when any of the wives of the neighborhood complained to her of the cruelty of their husbands, she, who had suffered many years of cruelty, was accustomed, like another Monica, to say to them, "Lay the blame rather on yourselves and your tongues." Saint Rita was also an apostle of true charity. As every virtue is weighed by the scales of charity which gives to it the gold of worth and merit, we find in the heart of Saint Rita a rich mine of charity towards God and towards her neighbor. Of her love for God there can be no doubt. Saint Rita was all love. The love of God consumed her, and for love of God, there was nothing she could do for her neighbor that she did not do. She visited the sick, nursed them, and prepared their meaty signs. She distributed bread and clothing among the needy poor, and, on one occasion, in imitation of Saint Martin of Tours, she gave half of her cloak to a poor person whom she met on the street, half naked and trembling with the cold. In a few words, we may say that no poor person in Rocca Perenna wanted anything if it were known to Saint Rita. Besides practicing the corporal works of mercy, Saint Rita, like a true apostle, employed much of her time in caring for the spiritual wants of her neighbors. She approached those whom she knew to be careless in the performance of their religious duties and persuaded them to mend their ways and become fervent Christians. In her frequent visits to the sick, she consoled them with soothing and holy words, exhorted them to patience and resignation, and it is among the traditions of Rocca Perenna that Saint Rita restored many sick persons to health by reciting one single Hail Mary by their bedsides. The disconsolate and the afflicted came also under the care of her apostolic zeal, and her advice to all whom she consoled and comforted was ever the same: place all the weight of your trials and tribulations on the shoulders of Jesus Christ. He will carry them for you. Remember, he once carried a heavy cross. And finally, Saint Rita dissolved enmities and hatred that existed among her neighbors, as did her father and mother when they were the peacemakers of Rocca Perenna. Her earnest words of burning zeal penetrated wrathful hearts, quenched the blazing fires of hatred and revenge, and made enemies kiss and embrace. Her numerous acts of charity, or the time spent in visiting the sick and the poor, did not, in the least, interfere with the care or government of her household, nor with her own private devotions. Besides saying the morning and night prayers which she had learned at the knees of her pious mother Amata, Saint Rita meditated every day on the principal mysteries of our holy faith, but her favorite meditation was the Passion of Jesus Christ. Many times while meditating this great mystery, she would fall into a trance, and on recovering her senses, it would seem as if she had been suffering a mysterious martyrdom in the interior of her soul. She also was very devout to Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament and made as many visits as possible to her parish church, for she dearly loved to be near that fire of divine love and never wished to leave it. Finally, that she might have protectors on earth, as well as powerful advocates in heaven, she was a devout servant of the Blessed Virgin Mary and a fervent client of Saint John the Baptist, Saint Augustine, and Saint Nicholas of Tolentine. Truly may we say, without detracting from the many women who are now saints in heaven, there is none more glorious than Sister Saint Rita of Cascia. Rita, before, and especially after her marriage, had made a honeycomb of her heart, so to speak, filled with the odor and sweetness of virtues. Each virtue represented, as it were, a beautiful and fragrant flower, bound together by the girdle or cincture of charity, and formed the most exquisite bouquet she could offer to her divine Lord after she had calmed the boisterous winds that had howled threateningly around her. During the time her husband was an easy prey to the ungovernable impulses of his violent passions. But alas, the days of harmony and peace were soon to be followed by a tragedy that was to cause grief and sorrow in the heart of Saint Rita. Though Saint Rita had reformed her husband and had also made him a man of peace, Ferdinando had not a few enemies in Rocca Perenna. Before his marriage, and for some years after, he had engaged in many disputes and contentions with companions as hot-headed and impulsive as himself, but as he was ready and adept with the stiletto or dagger, he was generally the victor over his adversaries. These persons became Ferdinando's enemies. A poisonous hatred rankled in their breasts, and though he avoided their company, they sought the occasion to avenge themselves. His enemies, not daring to encounter him singly, banded together as cowards generally do, and meeting him, one day outside of the walls of Rocca Perenna, attacked him, stabbed him to death, and left his lifeless body, lying by the roadside, bleeding from a dozen wounds. Some historians say that Ferdinando was not murdered in cold blood, as the saying is. They claim that he himself, in a fit of anger, provoked the quarrel and even struck the first blow of the altercation in which he lost his life. Others say that the violent death of Ferdinando was a visitation from God, in punishment for his extreme cruelty to Saint Rita during the early age of his marriage, but that we may piously believe, though he did not have the sweet consolation of receiving the last sacraments, that God had mercy on his soul, on account of the ocean of merits which his holy wife had treasured in heaven. When the news of the death of Ferdinando and all the circumstances connected with it reached the ears of Saint Rita, she was thrown into a paroxysm of grief. She wept as if her heart were breaking, and though her friends and kind neighbors tried as best they could to console her, she would not be consoled. Naturally, Saint Rita felt, as every good and holy wife must feel, the sudden taking away of her husband. But what grieved her heart and soul most was that he passed from this life to the other without being fortified with that viaticum, which gives the dying Christian the happy assurance of a safe journey from time to eternity. In her grief and sorrow, Saint Rita prayed to God from the altar of her heart and said to him, O God, enter not into judgment with thy servant Ferdinando, for in thy sight no one will be justified. She also prayed to Jesus, her divine Lord and Master, the judge of the living and the dead, and implored him to grant that his precious blood, shed for the redemption of mankind, was not shed in vain for the soul of her husband, Ferdinando. And out from the grief-laden heart of that sorrowful widow came so loud and plaintive a cry for the pardon of her husband's faults and failings, that the cry must have been heard in heaven, and as it penetrated the bowels of God's love, it moved him to mercy. Nor did Saint Rita, in the Gethsemane of her grief and sorrow, forget to have recourse to the Blessed Virgin, the Mother of the Seven Dolours, the sweet calm fortress of the afflicted, to whom, according to the great Saint Bernard, no one ever has recourse in vain. When the dead and bleeding body of her husband was brought home, Saint Rita, with more reason than the patriarch Jacob, who looked upon the blood-stained tunic of his beloved son Joseph, again gave full vent to her grief and sorrow, with sobs and sighs, followed by a torrent of tears. And then, all of a sudden, as if a whisper from heaven had reached her ears, in the twinkling of an eye, her sobs and sighs lost their voices, the fountains of her tears became dry, and arming herself with a resignation like to that of Jacob, her heart and soul praised the name of the Lord, who was pleased to take to himself the husband whom he had given her at the foot of his altar. O strong and valiant woman, here can we find your equal? To what can we compare you? You who bore with admirable patience the excessive grief and poignant sorrow which penetrated every fiber of your loving heart, as you gazed upon the bleeding remains of him whom the bonds of matrimony had made a part of your life. Not satisfied with that act of resignation to the will of God, who saw in the crucible of her patience thackerats of the gold of her fortitude, she adorned and embellished her resignation with the most precious stone of pardon for, in imitation of Jesus Christ, who, when dying on the wood of the cross, asked his heavenly Father to pardon his executioners, so also did Saint Rita plead for the murderers of her husband. She herself pardoned them from the bottom of her heart, thus putting into practice that holy doctrine which Jesus Christ taught from the pulpit of the cross. After the funeral ceremonies were over, and the mortal remains of her husband were placed in the cemetery of Rocca Perenna, Saint Rita continued the exercise of those virtues which she had already been in the habit of practicing, and free from many of the cares of her married life, she determined to live solely for God, the only Lord and Master of her soul. Death of her husband, Ferdinando, made Rita a widow, but she was not left alone. God had blessed her, as we have already observed, with two handsome sons who were now grown up, and on these she centered her utmost care and attention. She daily implored God, with the most fervent prayers, to preserve their innocence and aid her to guide them in the path of his holy law, in which she had instructed them. Giovanni and Paolo, the children of Saint Rita, became what their saintly mother molded them. They grew up God-loving and God-fearing children. They loved their good mother with all the fullness of their boyish hearts, and no boys could be more respectful or obedient to a mother than were Giovanni and Paolo. As they advanced in years, Saint Rita, with the quick perception of a mother, noticed that a change was taking place in the characters of her sons, and that sometimes, not unlike their departed father, they appeared to be sullen, morose, and irritable. Especially did she observe a notable change in Giovanni, who was scarcely 16 years of age. Young as they were, and even in spite of the religious training they had received from their mother, Giovanni and Paolo had become somewhat imbued with that false idea of honor and justice which made it incumbent on the nearest of kin to execute vengeance on the slayer of a relative. This criminal and unauthorized right of revenge was much in vogue in Italy at the time Saint Rita lived and was called la vendetta. Though Saint Rita had observed that, from time to time, her sons made remarks relative to the murder of their father, it never entered her mind that they had any thought of avenging his death. One day, however, from a conversation she overheard between her two sons, she learned, to her great surprise and sorrow, that they were inclined to revenge the assassination of their father. Like the good and saintly mother she was, Saint Rita determined to destroy and stifle so heinous and criminal a desire. Summoning Giovanni and Paolo to her side, she told them what she had heard and begged them, with tears and supplications, to erase from their minds all desire of revenge and to forget that their father was assassinated. She also placed before their eyes the example of Christ, who asked pardon for those who had crucified him and for whom lies suffered to give them eternal life. By means of this beautiful example, she sincerely hoped she would be able to persuade her sons to pardon the murderers of their father. She furthermore reminded them that though they had lost their earthly father, they would gain a heavenly one if they would pardon from their hearts. And finally, she represented to them the terrible sin the homicide commits, and plainly told them that they themselves would be murderers if they avenged the death of their father. In this manner did Saint Rita try to keep and guide her sons in the path of the fear of God. After some time, as we may read in the decree of her canonization, when she saw her sons persist in their desire for vengeance, she fled to the crucifix and related the whole affair to Christ, fervently beseeching him either to change the desires of her sons or no longer spare their lives. God heard the prayer of Saint Rita. Both her sons died within a year, well prepared to go before the judgment seat of Almighty God. O glorious Saint Rita, the fame of your sacrifice will never die. The pages of history make mention of no sacrifice more generous than your sacrifice. It is true Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac, but he was commanded by Almighty God to do so. Your sacrifice was an exact copy of the sacrifice which the Eternal Father made of his only Son on the cross for you. Not satisfied with pardoning the murderers of your husband, even saved their lives by offering to God the sacrifice of the lives of your two beloved sons. Giovanni and Paolo. Rita was now alone in the world. She was both widow and orphan. The bodies of her husband and two sons were lying side by side in the cemetery of Rocca Perenna, and her aged parents, Antonio and Amata, had gone to their reward, though we do not know the exact time of their death. Free, therefore, from all the ties that had hitherto bound her to the world, Saint Rita resolved to live solely for God and to spend her time wholly occupied in the service of God. Accordingly, she spent a goodly part of her time in a retired part of the church, praying with ardent devotion and recollection, and never ceased to give thanks to God for all the graces and favors he had bestowed upon her during the whole course of her life. And because she hoped that God would lead her, one day, into that other state of life to which she aspired, even from the days of her early girlhood, she again offered herself, body and soul, to God, renouncing forever, for the love of God, all the joys and pleasures the world might offer her. With her heart thus filled with the fire of divine love, one day Saint Rita happened to be in church listening to a sermon. In the course of his preaching, the priest had occasion to quote the words of Christ, "If thou wilt be perfect, go sell what thou hast and give to the poor, and come, follow me." Saint Rita considered these words a special invitation from Jesus Christ and resolved to obey the divine summons and put into practice the evangelical counsel by renouncing all her temporal goods and enter some religious house wherein she could follow, day by day, her divine spouse and master Jesus Christ until the end of her life. From that day forward, Saint Rita added new fasts to the many she was already wont to observe and increased the number and rigor of her penances. She now fasted on the vigils of the feasts of her special patrons, Saint John the Baptist, Saint Augustine, and Saint Nicholas of Tolentine. and she daily solicited their aid and assistance to help her to fit herself for the religious state to which she aspired. After the death of her husband, she put on a garment of haircloth and repeatedly punished her delicate body with a discipline, and in imitation of the holy widow Judith, she lived a most retired life. So strong and vehement was Saint Rita's desire to separate herself from all contact with the world that she actually, so to speak, turned her house into a holy prison. She closed all the windows of her home, except one near the door and a little one in the roof, through which she could look up to heaven. She never left her home unless to go to church, or to visit the sick, or to perform works of charity among her poor and needy neighbors. There is near the house in which Saint Rita lived a very high reef called the Reef of Roccaporena. Concerning this reef, it is tradition that Saint Rita climbed many times to the topmost part of this reef to be nearer to heaven, and that she spent many hours there in prayer and meditation. Words fail to tell the true story of the penitential and retired life of Saint Rita after the death of her two sons. She spent most of her time praying, conversing with her beloved Jesus, asking him continually to admit her among the virgins who served him within the sacred and holy walls of the cloister. Many and many a time did she say to Jesus, "O my dear Lord and Master, since I am free now, when will the time come when you will admit me into the haven of religion?" Seeing, however, that her divine lover did not give a quick response to her prayers, she wept bitterly, thinking that her divine master would not open to her the doors of the cloister, because there was something wanting in her love and affection towards him. In those times of affliction, a few moments' meditation on the abandonment of Jesus by his eternal Father, as he hung dying on the cross of Calvary, consoled her, and she would say to herself, "My loving Savior drunk to the very dregs the bitter cup of abandonment," to animate and teach that all who would walk on the sorrowful way of the cross must at least taste of one drop of his bitter chalice. Thus consoled, Saint Rita would renew her supplications to Jesus, asking him again and again to open to her the doors of the cloister for Saint Rita had made up her mind to continue knocking at the door of the Sacred Heart of Jesus until she would hear his sweet voice saying to her, "Arise, Rita, make haste, my beloved spouse, and come." We already know Saint Rita was extremely anxious to embrace the religious state of life, and since she had a particular devotion to the great Saint Augustine and his spiritual son Saint Nicholas of Tolentine, she desired to become a spiritual daughter of the saint by joining a community of nuns that was governed and guided by the same rule which Saint Augustine gave to the community of religious he founded when he was Bishop of Hippo in Africa. At the time Saint Rita lived in Roccaporena, there were two communities of Augustinian nuns in Cascia. One community resided in the convent known by the name Saint Mary Magdalene, or the Madalena. The other was named after Saint Lucy the Martyr. When these convents were founded we do not know, but we do know that in the year of our Lord 1329, the Bishop of Spoleto granted certain privileges to the community of the convent of Saint Lucy. Saint Rita knew that in both of those convents the nuns served God to their heart's content, and burning with those desires which were kindled in her heart when she was but a child, she became more anxious than ever to become a nun and follow the Lamb whithersoever she prayed and meditated until it was time to return home. One day, while she knelt in the little oratory of her house, her eyes fixed on the crucifix, speaking to Jesus and telling him how anxious she was to enter the cloister and become a nun, a ray of divine consolation penetrated her heart and soul. Saint Rita arose from her kneeling posture and prepared to go to Cascia. Once on the highway, that ray of divine consolation gave haste to her footsteps, which brought her direct to the very door of the convent of the Madalena. With a trembling hand she knocked at the convent door, and in answer to her call, the door was opened by the sister portress, who, learning that Saint Rita desired to speak with the prioress, politely ushered her into the guest chamber. When the prioress, a sweet-faced venerable nun, came, Saint Rita made known, in as few words as possible, the object of her visit. She told the prioress that from the time she was a child, she had desired to consecrate her virginity to God. That she would have done so had not obedience to her parents prevented her, but being free now, she coveted the Augustinian habit, so that she might better serve the Lord, though she recognized she was unworthy to become a spiritual daughter of the great and glorious Saint Augustine. The prioress listened with attention to the humble but earnest petition of Saint Rita to be admitted into the community, and kindly told her that she would present her application for membership before a chapter meeting of the nuns of the community. We must observe here that it is a rule of the Augustinian Institute of Nuns not to admit to their communities any but young girls, whose vocations are certain, though widows may also be admitted, but only by special dispensation. We must therefore not be surprised that the nuns of the Maddalena convent of Cascia refused to admit Saint Rita into the community, and indeed, a majority of the nuns hinted that since no widow had been received into the convent from the time of its foundation, it would be a blot on the Maddalena were they to admit Saint Rita as a member of the community, though they knew her to be a person of the most irreproachable character and possessed even of eminent piety and sanctity. When the prioress of the convent told Saint Rita that the nuns had, in public chapter, voted against admitting her as a member of the community, she received the news with a calm exterior, though in her heart she was very much disappointed. Instead of returning to Roccaporena, Saint Rita remained in Cascia in the house of a friend, and after a short lapse of time, made a second application only to receive a second refusal. She applied a third time, and most eloquently besought the nuns to admit her into their community, even as a servant, alleging that she did not consider herself a worthy companion of the spouses of Jesus Christ. Her pleading was all in vain, and because God wished to try further the patience of Rita, he permitted the nuns to remain firm in their decision, and thus Saint Rita was told for the third time by the prioress that it was impossible to admit her as a member of the community, and that she should cease further importunities. When the door of the Maddalena was closed against her, Saint Rita returned to Roccaporena, judging that the time had not yet arrived for her to obtain that happiness to which she aspired. Yet deep down in her heart, she felt that God would soon come to her aid, and by his omnipotence help her to overcome what the prioress of the Maddalena convent has said was impossible. Her Saint Rita returned to Roccaporena, judging that the time had not yet arrived for her to obtain that happiness to which she aspired. Yet deep down in her heart, she felt that God would soon come to her aid, and by his omnipotence help her to overcome what the prioress of the Maddalena convent has said was impossible. With the words of the prioress of the Maddalena ringing in her ears. My dear woman, it is impossible for you to become a member of our community, Saint Rita determined to use every holy means to make possible what human lips had told her was impossible. With this determination dominant in her mind, Saint Rita spent nearly all her days and a goodly portion of her nights supplicating her beloved Jesus to shorten the time of her anxiety and admit her as one of his brides within the enclosed walls of the cloister. Not content with importuning Jesus with the most fervent prayers and exercises of penance and mortification, Saint Rita also implored the aid of her patron saint, John the Baptist, Saint Augustine, and Saint Nicholas of Tolentine, firmly believing that through their powerful intercession, God would hasten the fulfillment of the only desire her heart sought in this world. Saint Rita was not disappointed in her confidence and hope, and she, who preferred to be the lowliest among the brides of Christ than to be the most honored of the highest ones of the earth, was soon to taste that happiness she had sought from the time she was but a little girl. Yea, the time had come when Saint Rita was to make her entrance into the cloister in a most miraculous manner. One night, while engaged in prayer and meditation, she heard a loud knock at the door of her house and a voice which called Rita, Rita. As the hour was late, naturally, a slight feeling of fear overcame her for a moment, but a whispered prayer to heaven gave her the courage to approach the window, which she opened and glanced out to ascertain who called her. Seeing no one at the door, Saint Rita thought that what she heard might have been an illusion or perhaps a ruse of the evil one to divert her from her prayers. Signing herself with the sign of the cross, she resumed her prayers with a redoubled fervor. Again she was interrupted in her prayers by the same voice which said, Rita, Rita, fear not. God will admit you into the cloister as Eli's spouse. This time Saint Rita understood the true meaning of the double call that had fallen on her overjoyed ears, and inflamed by the fire of divine love, her heart gave itself up to so fervent a prayer that she became wrapped in ecstasy and saw in a vision the three saints whom God had sent to aid her. They were Saint John the Baptist, Saint Augustine, and Saint Nicholas of Tolentine. And scarcely had they given her to understand that the cup of her heart's desire was to be filled to overflowing. Then she heard a celestial voice, the voice of her Jesus, who called and said to her, "Come, Rita, my beloved. It is now time for you to enter the Madalena convent whose door was so often closed against you." Awakening, as it were, from a profound sleep, Rita rose from the prie-dieu on which she had been kneeling, went to the window, and saw a person of venerable mien and aspect standing at the door. He wore a garment of camel's hair, cinctured with a leather girdle, and he made signs that she should follow him. Saint Rita, recognizing that the person who beckoned her to follow him was no other than her patron saint. John the Baptist, whom she had seen in the vision, left her house at once, and with her heart filled with spiritual joy and gladness, she followed her holy guide. They climbed together the rugged steeps of the reef called Schiapo, on whose skirt Rocca Perenna is situated. When she had arrived at the summit of the reef, there appeared to her Saint Augustine and Saint Nicholas of Tolentine, and she felt as if she were standing, so to speak, on empty Thabor. So refulgent was the light which radiated from the countenances of her three patrons. Dazzled by the spectacle, Saint Rita prostrated herself at their feet and thanked them with humble and devout reverence for all the favors they had obtained for her, and again she recommended herself to their protection. They commanded her to arise and follow them. She obeyed immediately and walked behind them as they directed their steps in the direction of Cascia. Every step she took told Saint Rita that she was drawing nearer and nearer to the long-desired goal, and her heart was filled with indescribable joy as she listened to the heave-inly words of her guides as they conversed with one another on the way. It was indeed a memorable journey, and Saint Rita must have felt as did the two pilgrims who conversed with Christ on the road to Emmaus, for when she arrived at Cascia, yea, even at the very door of the Madalena convent, the desire of consecrating herself, body and soul, to her beloved Jesus was more ardent than ever. Finding, as was natural, the door and the windows of the Madalena closed tightly, her guides, nevertheless, led her into the cloister, and then addressed her these words: "Rita, remain a rational bee in the garden of the spouse whom you have so long and ardently loved, so that, collecting the flowers of virtues, you may build a sweet honeycomb. You are now in the house of your spouse, Jesus. Love him with all your heart and soul, and your eternal salvation is secure. Return thanks to God for so great a favor done in your behalf. Praise his infinite mercy, and publish that there is nothing impossible to God. Rita, the impossible is overcome in your behalf." Having said these words, the three saints disappeared. Saint Rita, overcome with happiness because she was now within the cloister, spent the remainder of the night in giving thanks to the Lord for the singular favor he had bestowed upon her. When the morning was come, and the nuns of the Madalena discovered that a secular was within the cloister, they were both surprised and astonished. "Who is she? How did she get in?" ran from lip to lip, as with wondering eyes the nuns fixed their gaze on Saint Rita. Some of the nuns began to suspect that one of the community had secretly allowed her to enter the cloister, while others thought that, perhaps, through negligence the door of the convent had been left unlocked. However, when some of the surprise that attended the discovery of Saint Rita in the cloister had passed away, the nuns, in a body, approached her and asked what manner of person she was, and by what means she had entered their cloister. Saint Rita, with humility written in her gladsome eyes, and with humility guiding the sweet and convincing eloquence of her eager lips, thus answered them: "I am that poor widow of Rocca Perenna, who many times asked to be admitted as a member of your community, and was as many times refused as unworthy of so great a happiness. But know, beloved superioress and sisters, that God, wishing to do me a singular favor, sent, last night, to my house in Rocca Perenna, his precursor, Saint John the Baptist, accompanied by that Son of Heaven, Saint Augustine, and that Star of Heaven, Saint Nicholas of Tolentine, to conduct me into your midst. Nevertheless, I ask you, in the name of that God who has favored me with his mercy, to accept me as a member of your community." The nuns of the Madalena listened with amazement while Saint Rita related how she had been conducted into the cloister, and when she had concluded her story, all the nuns with one voice cried out that they accepted her as a companion, and then humbly besought her pardon for having refused so many times her request for admission into their convent home. Indeed, was the joy that filled the heart, and when the nuns of the Madalena proclaimed unanimously that they would gladly accept her as a companion and admit her into their community. And not unmindful of the command of her divine spouse when he said, "Hearken, O daughter, and see and incline thy ear, and forget thy people, and thy father's house, and the king shall greatly desire thy beauty." Before receiving the religious habit, she returned to Rocca Purena to sell whatever property she possessed and distribute the proceeds amongst the poor and needy, so that she might not have a single tie or obligation that would bind her to the world. She lost no time in putting into execution the evangelical counsel. She sold everything she had in the world to be able to follow, without hindrance, her crucified Lord. Yes, she even did more. She renounced her native village, for she is called not Saint Rita of Rocca Purena, but rather Saint Rita of Cascia. Returning to Cascia, she repaired at once to hear Mass in the church, which is today the reliquary of her body. While there she heard a sermon on the words of Christ, "I am the way, and the truth, and the life." These words made a deep impression on her mind, and though Saint Rita was an unlettered woman, an interior divine light made her understand the real and true meaning of the text. After meditating for some time on the security of that sacred way, on the infallibility of that divine, and on the eternity of that happy life, her heart became filled with a burning desire to walk henceforth on no other way, to seek no other truth, to aspire to no other life. For she said to herself, "I know my beloved Jesus is the way, and the truth, and the life." Consumed, therefore, with the most ardent desire of following her divine spouse, Saint Rita received the Augustinian habit in the convent of the Maddalena at Cascia, and took the name of Rita di Antonio, as may be learned from the archives of the Maddalena convent. Saint Rita was now in the home of her long-coveted desires. She was now on the way to become a bride of Christ, and a spiritual daughter of her beloved protector Saint Augustine, and a spiritual sister of her other protector Saint Nicholas of Tolentine. She therefore began her novitiate with so much joy and consolation of soul that all the nuns were both charmed and edified with their new companion, and thanked God for having placed in their midst such a marvelous model of every virtue. From the very first day of her novitiate, Saint Rita began to live according to both the letter and the spirit of the convent rules and exercises. And in order that she might bring herself and make herself nearer and more acceptable to her beloved Jesus, she began the practice of humility both in word and deed. Her progress in this beautiful virtue was surprisingly rapid, and she was a novice but a short time when she had learned to consider herself far beneath the other religious, and she was often heard to say, "I am not worthy to be the servant of so many faithful servants of Christ." Her heart was now stripped of earthly affection, and not a day passed that Saint Rita did not offer it to her divine spouse, earnestly imploring him to imprint his image in her heart, as a pledge that he had espoused her. Thus, on one occasion, when she was asked why she was so compassionate to the poor, Saint Rita answered in an humble manner, "I love the poor of Jesus, on account of Jesus, because I have the image of Jesus stamped in my heart." On another occasion, when Saint Rita was assailed by Satan, who tried to persuade her that she could save her soul by returning to the world, as well as if she remained in the convent, she put the infernal enemy to flight by simply saying to him, "Begone, Satan. I belong to Jesus Christ. I have no will of my own. My will is that of my beloved spouse, whose image is imprinted in my heart." Thus Saint Rita, who had chosen Jesus Christ for her Lord and Master, not only surrendered to him her body, her soul, and all her worldly possession, but also her own sweet will, so that Jesus Christ became, as it were, the motor power of all her thoughts and actions. Such perfect resignation to the will of God on the part of the novice Rita did not pass unnoticed by the nuns of the Maddalena, who could not help observing that she was a model novice, and indeed many of the nuns, who had grown old in the cloister, did not look on Saint Rita as a novice, but considered her rather a religious who had already attained the height of perfection. Especially was the prioress, she who but a short time before had told Saint Rita that it was impossible for her to become a member of the community, edified by the religious conduct of the novice. And one day after she had spoken, with some length, on the yoke of the religious state, as exemplified in the observance of the rule, in the roughness and poverty of the clothing, in the abstinence from food, and in the continuous exercise of mortification, the superioress felt as if she were listening to the voice of an angel when Saint Rita said, "Reverend superioress, as soon as I am instructed by my superiors, and as soon as the ark of religion is placed on my shoulders, I shall shut my eyes so as not to miss the way. for I know I shall walk securely and safely on the straight way of my sweet Jesus. As did the kine that carried the ark of the Lord when it was restored by the Philistines. Guided, therefore, by the will of her divine lover, Saint, Rita was a model novice. She willingly and cheerfully performed the most laborious occupations of the convent and was never happier than when she was employed in some lowly office. She was prompt and punctual at all the community exercises, and the sound of the bell that called the nuns to chapel was for Saint Rita, the voice of God. In the community parlor, where the nuns assembled to pass their time in innocent recreation, Saint Rita showed by her joyful countenance how much she enjoyed the pious conversation of her companions, and when she herself spoke, her words possessed a mysterious power which inclined the souls of her hearers to God. Thus, with her heart in God, and her eyes always fixed on God, Saint Rita found, during the time of her noviceship, the yoke of the religious life so sweet that she never ceased to thank God for his unspeakable goodness in having conducted her into the cloister to be a companion of his chosen brides. And as a memorial of her gratitude to God, Saint Rita solemnized every year the anniversary of her entrance as a novice into the Madalena convent. Last the time came for which Saint Rita sighed so long. She had completed her novitiate, and the happy day was come on which she was to make the solemn profession of the 3 vows of obedience, poverty, and chastity, according to the rule of the great and illustrious Saint Augustine. She made her profession in the chapel of the Madalena, in the presence of the nuns, and thus became the spouse of the Son of God. Her profession filled Saint Rita's heart and soul with unspeakable joy and gladness. She gave herself wholly to Jesus, and Jesus became wholly hers. And to make her understand that the sacrifice she had made was pleasing to God, she was favored with a mysterious vision that delighted her heart and inflamed her soul with the ardent desire to arrive at the pinnacle of religious perfection by means of the 3 vows she had made, aided by the virtues which she had begun to practice from her earliest childhood. Having made her solemn profession, the new spouse of Christ spent nearly all the day in giving thanks to God for having accepted her as his bride, when she did not consider herself even worthy to be his slave, and recalling to mind all the great favors God had bestowed upon her, and especially that of sending 3 saints from heaven to conduct her into the cloister so that he might make her his bride. Saint Rita shed tears of joy and felt that the plenitude of heaven had descended upon her. On the night of the day of her espousals with her divine fiancé, through the 3 vows of religion, Saint Rita was the recipient of a singular favor that made her supremely happy and pointed out to her a sure way to arrive at the port of eternal salvation. As she was kneeling before the crucifix in her little cell, she saw in a vision, as the patriarch Jacob saw in a sleep, a ladder standing upon the earth, and the top thereof touching heaven. Gazing attentively at the ladder, she observed God at the top of the ladder inviting her to ascend, and she also saw angels ascending and descending by it. While contemplating the spectacle, she heard a voice which said to her, "Rita, if you wish to unite yourself to God in heaven, you must climb this ladder." When the vision disappeared, Saint Rita felt much consoled and was filled with heavenly transports because she had seen God, though it was only for a brief moment. Saint Rita began, at once, to consider the mystery of the ladder she had seen in the vision, and remembering that they were angels who ascended and descended by it, she came to understand that she must become like them if she would follow in their footsteps. Penetrating deeper into the mystery, the very steps of the ladder taught her that she herself must build at once a spiritual ladder on whose steps, made of virtues, she could ascend to heaven and enjoy there, for all eternity, the presence and the companionship of God. Saint Rita, therefore, understood the meaning of themistry of the vision, and if as a novice she was perfect, she now began to advance from virtue to virtue, ascending, day after day, higher and higher on the ladder of religious perfection. And fearful lest the wind of vainglory should in any way extinguish the light or luster of her virtues, Saint Rita safeguarded them as carefully as she could by hiding them from the eyes of public gaze. And considering also that to ascend to heaven by the ladder of perfection, it is necessary to put the foot where first the hand was placed, she judged prudently that to assure the merit of the work of her hands, it was best to hide her works with the steps she took for her advancement in the beautiful virtue of humility. Sister Saint Rita understood the true meaning of the words of her divine bridegroom, "Learn of me, because 1 a.m. meek and humble of heart. He first resolution saint Rita made, after her 10 solemn profession, was to arrive at the summit of religious perfection by a strict observance of the vows she professed in the chapel of the Maddalena convent. Being closely united to Jesus by the sacred bonds of her vows, she began, at once, to climb the ladder of religious perfection by placing her feet on the step of obedience, which is, indeed, the first step or rung of the ladder of religious perfection. That obedience is the first step of the ladder of religious perfection, we learn from our Holy Father Saint Augustine, who said poverty is a great virtue because it rules over riches. Chastity is also a great virtue because it dominates the flesh. But the virtue of obedience is greater than either poverty or chastity because it rules and restrains the intellect and the will. The Holy Ghost expresses the same truth when he says better is obedience than victims. Hence, obedience is more excellent than poverty or chastity because the spiritual powers of the soul, which are sacrificed to God, are more excellent than the exterior goods of sensual gratification which are sacrificed by the two other vows. To understand the nature of obedience, as regards the religious state, we must observe that there are two kinds or classes of obedience. In the first place, there is an obedience that is called blind obedience. This obedience has no eyes, as it were. It inclines the subject to obey the command of the superior without questioning the command, without taking into consideration the difficulty of obeying the command, or without adverting if the command be unjust or impossible. The expression blind obedience signifies not an unreasoning or unreasonable submission to authority, but a keen appreciation of the rights of authority, the reasonableness of authority, and blindness only to such selfish or worldly considerations as would lessen regard for authority. This blind obedience may be called, and is, perfect obedience. The second kind of obedience has as many eyes, so to speak, as the animals and the wheels of the cart that the prophet Ezekiel saw in a vision, and the subject who is guided by this obedience understands perfectly the difficulties of the command of his superiors. He feels how repugnant it is to the intellect and the violence it does the will. Yet, notwithstanding this knowledge, he obeys promptly and joyfully, considering easy even that which is impossible. This kind of obedience is superlative and therefore most perfect. Jesus Christ himself gave us an example of this obedience. Being divine wisdom itself, he became obedient even to the death of the cross, though he knew death was repugnant to his divinity. And again, when he was suffering a terrible agony in the Garden of Gethsemane, did he not cry out, "Father, if it be possible, let this chalice pass from me," and then, as if recollecting the task that was before him, he added, "Yet not my will, but thine be done." The angels also practice this kind of obedience, and though they are pure spirits, endowed with superior knowledge, nevertheless, they not only obey God with diligence and promptitude, but they even make themselves obedient to the welfare of creatures, though they know the creatures are inferior to them in everything. Now, since this most perfect obedience, more worthy of reward, because more meritorious than blind obedience, is truly characteristic of the angels, we may call those persons angels or angelic persons, who on earth are imitators of the angels in their obedience. Judged by this standard saint, Rita was indeed an angelic woman. So obedient indeed was she, that when commanded by her superioress to do anything, even though she knew the command was impossible, she obeyed with the same promptitude as if the command was easily executed. It is related by many authors of the life of Saint Rita that the superioress of the Maddalena, in order to put her obedience to a test, commanded the saint to water daily a dead and withered plant in the convent garden. Saint Rita obeyed without saying a single word about the uselessness of her labor. She watered the plant every day for a year, though she knew it would not revive without a miracle. God, however, rewarded the obedience of Saint Rita. To the great astonishment of the nuns, the dead plant revived, put forth leaves and flowers, and was the most beautiful of all the plants in the convent garden. We will cite another beautiful example of the obedience and resignation of Saint Rita. Pope Nicholas V had declared the year 1450 a jubilee year, to which were attached many indulgences that could be gained by those visiting Rome. As some of the nuns had received permission to make the journey, Saint Rita, prompted by motives of piety and zeal, desired to accompany them. She therefore went to the superioress and humbly asked permission to go to Rome with the other nuns, so that she might gain the indulgences of the Jubilee. The superioress, looking at the disfigured forehead of Saint Rita, of which we shall speak in another chapter, did not, at first feel inclined to grant the permission. However, after a few moments of consideration, she dismissed Saint Rita, saying, "Sister Rita, I will permit you to make the journey to Rome, provided the wound on your forehead be healed, when the sisters are ready to start on the journey." Leaving the presence of the superioress Saint, Rita went at once to the chapel to ask her divine spouse if it were pleasing to him that she should make the journey to Rome. If so, she supplicated him to heal the wound on her forehead, but if not, she would resign herself to his holy will and the will of her superioress. God, seeing the humble resignation of Saint Rita, and knowing the obedient spirit of his humble and devout servant, heard her prayer, and wonderful to relate, the wound was immediately healed, and Saint Rita was granted permission to accompany the other sisters to Rome. So perfect, indeed, was the obedience of Saint Rita that she would have rather died than not obey the least command of her superiors, whom she considered the representatives of God and her guides and directors. She was like the sheep that always hear the voice of the shepherd and follow him. Free from the slavery of her own will, Saint Rita was so perfectly united to the will of God that she had no self-confidence and abandoned herself entirely to God. Hence, so Christ-like was the obedience of Sister Saint Rita, that her every act and all her acts were agreeable to God, for, having once placed her feet on the first step of the ladder of religious perfection, she ascended higher and higher, and nearer to God, and became what she truly was, a model of the most perfect obedience. The last chapter we have seen that Saint Rita began her ascent on the ladder of religious perfection by the strict observance of the vow of obedience. Desirous of ascending higher, she next placed her feet, so to speak, on the second step of the ladder, which step is evangelical poverty. Poverty is so eminent a virtue that Jesus Christ himself professed it when he was born poor in a cold and wretched stable and died naked on the cross. His only belongings were 3 nails and a crown of thorns. Moreover, in his Sermon on the Mount, Christ gave poverty the first place among the Beatitudes when he said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." As regards Saint Rita, who knew well that the excellence of holy poverty consists not so much in despising riches as in renouncing the desire of possessing them, she made such rapid progress in the practice of this virtue that after she had made her vows, she never had the least affection for riches. We have already learned that before Saint Rita began her novitiate in the convent of the Maddalena, she sold all she possessed in the world and distributed the proceeds among God's poor. Thus, in order to be poor, she renounced everything in the world and of the world, so that she might follow her divine spouse, Jesus Christ. So filled indeed was Saint Rita with the desire of belonging entirely to God and of seeking nothing but the things of God, that, when she made her solemn profession, she consecrated herself without reserve to God. Her heart thus stripped of every affection to temporal things, and so free was her soul from every inclination to worldly interests, that she considered them the enemies of her eternal salvation. Because Saint Rita loved holy poverty so much, she never wore but one habit, the very one she received the day of her entrance into religion. This habit she never laid aside during all the long years she lived in the convent, and when she died she was buried with the same habit. And even to this day, though centuries have passed since her pure soul ascended to heaven, it serves as her shroud, a splendid monument of her heroic poverty. Many and many a time was she asked by the nuns why she continued to wear such an old and patched habit. Saint Rita always answered with humility, "Sisters, I wear this old habit to imitate the poverty of my spouse, Jesus Christ." She meditated every day on the poverty of Jesus, and many times while at meditation in the chapel, she was heard to cry out, "O my good Jesus, to clothe me, you stripped yourself. To make me rich, you lived and died in extreme poverty." So penetrated was Saint Rita's soul with the spirit of poverty that she was content to occupy a small room or cell, whose only furniture consisted of a prie-dieu, a hard bench that served as a bed, a stone was her pillow, and the walls of her cell were decorated with a few pictures representing different scenes of our Lord's Passion. There, in that little cell, Saint Rita was supremely happy. And when not engaged in conventible or community exercises, she was accustomed to spend hours before the crucifix, saying to her divine Lord and Master, "O my sweet Jesus, why should I, a vile creature, a miserable sinner, and seek a better cell than the one I have? Why should I desire comforts or pleasure in food, clothing, or recreation, when I know that you had no place to lay your head, and that you suffered so much for me, naked, wounded, and nailed to a cross?" One particular incident in the life of Saint Rita will give you an idea how detached she was from earthly things. On the occasion of her journey to Rome, in company with the other nuns, Saint Rita happened to find on the way a gold coin which she threw into the swift waters of a river they had to cross. The nuns were surprised at her act, which they considered, at least, imprudent, and some of them reproved her, saying, "We may stand in need of money before we return to Cascia." Saint Rita, sorry that she had displeased her sisters, responded to their complaint with these words, "Sister, I threw that piece of money into the river, because, though the coin was small and of little weight, to me it seemed very heavy, so heavy, indeed, that I did not have the strength to carry it any longer." Not only did Saint Rita practice evangelical poverty, but she also tried to induce others to practice it by her urgent words. Many times did she say to the nuns, "My dear sisters, if you wish to have the esteem and confidence of the good and virtuous, have little or no love for temporal riches. Observe strictly your vow of poverty. A nun who wishes to belong entirely to God must be totally detached from all earthly things." Saint Rita believed, as Saint Paul did, that all things outside of Jesus which did not help to gain Jesus are as filth and uncleanness. She was a perfect model of poverty. She was a true religious and truly poor, and the example of her life in the convent was a sublime hymn, so to speak, in praise and honor of holy poverty. During her long years in the Maddalena convent, Saint Rita was never heard to say, "This is mine," or "That is yours," for having once put her feet on the step of poverty, the second step of the ladder of religious perfection, she only heard the sweet voice of her beloved Jesus saying to her, "Come, Rita, I am poor, and follow me." Have already said that Saint Rita was a perfect model of obedience and poverty. We will now say that Saint Rita, by a miracle of God's grace, was a perfect model of chastity, for this beautiful virtue, as professed and practiced in the religious state, is really a miracle of grace. Nature cannot give it. It is truly a gift of God. True, we cannot place Saint Rita in the number of those virgins who form an assemblage apart in heaven. Still, because she preserved always the virginity of her soul, she was like to the angels in purity. We know that from her earliest childhood it was Saint Rita's ardent desire to consecrate herself wholly and entirely to God, and that she had the greatest horror of anything which might, in the least, mar the untarnished whiteness of virginal purity. Having embraced the marriage state, not because she wished it, but rather in obedience to the will of God and that of her parents, Saint Rita, while living in that state, observed the most perfect conjugal chastity. Even when Saint Rita was wife and mother, the desire of embracing the more perfect state of life was ever uppermost in her mind. And when death had bereft her of husband and children, we know how promptly she hastened, and how she succeeded in a miraculous manner to bury herself, so to speak, in the cloister, to become, first, a domestic of God, and then a bride of the Son of God. Once within the walls of the cloister, Saint Rita became an angelic woman, for she acquired, aided by the grace of God and the strict observance of the vow of chastity, that purity which is characteristic of the angels. So jealous, indeed, was Saint Rita of the vow of chastity that she kept a vigilant guard over her senses, curbing them and keeping them away from whatever might be the occasion of offense against her vow. She guarded her eyes by keeping them always fixed on Jesus, her ears by listening only to whatever spoke of God, her tongue by speaking only the language of heaven, and her thoughts and her heart by renewing every day the oblation of herself to God. The angelic life that Saint Rita led in the convent did not escape the notice of the arch-enemy of souls, and God, who wished that the saint should enhance her fidelity as spouse of his Son, permitted Lucifer to tempt and assail her, sometimes by flattery or pleasing suggestions. But Saint Rita was too well schooled in virtù to prove a victim to the wiles of the crafty Lucifer, and just as often as he tried to tempt her to offend against her vow, just as often was he defeated. Indeed, Saint Rita seemed to know that her chastity was to be the chief object of Lucifer's attacks, hence to triumph over so powerful an enemy, she directed all her efforts to make her body subject to the spirit. The mean Saint Rita used to subjugate her body might be called by those who have no faith, or by those who love the pandering luxury of the world, the extravagance of folly. But to Saint Rita, it was a sweet folly, the folly of her spouse, Jesus Christ, who died on the cross. To subjugate her body, she punished it with fasting and abstinence. She observed 3 Lents in the year, fasted the vigils of the feasts of the Blessed Virgin, and all the vigils of the feasts of her particular patrons, Saint John the Baptist, Saint Augustine, and Saint Nicholas of Tolentine. She ate but 1 meal a day, and this meal consisted for the most part of bread and water. By weakening her body, Saint Rita became spiritually stronger and better able to defend herself against the evil one. Hence she was accustomed to say, we must not have any pity for our bodies. The more we pander and fondle them, the more rebellious they will become against the Spirit. Guided by this rule, Saint Rita punished her body without pity, and whenever she felt the least symptom of rebellion in her body, occasioned by some diabolical temptation against her vow, if it happened to be winter, she would cast herself on the snow-covered ground of the convent garden and remain there until the temptation ceased, or she would put a finger or foot into the fire and burn away, so to speak, the temptation. Then, lifting her soul to God, Saint Rita would meditate on the rigors and eternity of the punishments of hell and say to herself, Rita, you cannot suffer, for even a little while, the snow or fire which God has sent from heaven. How then would you be able to suffer the eternal pains of hell? Do you wish to go to live forever with the condemned souls? Certainly not. Then fulfill faithfully the promises you have made to God. Observe your vow, and you will never offend your divine spouse. Acting in this manner, and reckoning that the sufferings of this world are not to be compared with the glory to come, Saint Rita kept her rebellious flesh in subjection and was able to overcome every attack of Lucifer against her vow. And aided also by the sign of the cross, and with the sweet names of Jesus and Mary ever on her lips, and fortified by the continual exercise of penance of which we shall speak in our next chapter, Saint Rita preserved the flower of her purity, defended as it was by the thorns of mortification, as the rose preserves its beauty, defended by the thorns which nature give it for its protection. For a greater security of her chastity, of which the common enemy of souls was continually trying to rob her, Saint Rita, like the holy man Job, made a covenant with her eyes never to look at or even think of anything that might be the occasion of fault against her purity. Never happier than when she was in the chapel or in the silence and solitude of her little cell, Saint Rita actually disliked to go to the convent parlor to converse with seculars, unless it was to give spiritual advice or console some afflicted soul. And when she was obliged by necessity or obedience to go outside the convent, she wore a heavy veil over her face, and if by chance she met a friend or acquaintance on the street who recognized her, she never stopped to speak, it being a common saying with her. In ordinary conversation with seculars, a nun loses much and gains little or nothing. More than once, while conversing with the nuns, did she say to them, Sisters, be careful where you look, where you go, and with whom you convene. There is always danger in what we see becoming the occasion of offense against God and our vow. Hence Sister Saint Rita, by crucifying her flesh, by curbing her senses, and by the grace of God, through Jesus Christ, became a model of religious chastity. While living in the world, Saint Rita had led a life of virtue and sanctity, but when she left the world to become a bride of Jesus Christ, she added new virtues to the old, and spread everywhere around her that sweetest and most fragrant of odors, which Saint Paul calls the odor of Christ. Filled as Rita's heart was with love for her heavenly spouse, it became the productive garden of all kinds of virtues, and though she tried to hide her virtues under the cloak of humility, the more she tried, the more manifest they became. United in spiritual matrimony with Jesus Christ, Saint Rita's utmost endeavors were to maintain inviolable fidelity to Jesus Christ. He had called her to be his bride, and on the day of her solemn profession, had placed on her finger the golden ring of religion, set with the most precious jewels, obedience, poverty, and chastity. Wrapped in the folds of the love of Jesus Christ, and knowing that the practice of virtues would make her more and more like him, who is virtue itself, Saint Rita availed herself of every occasion to practice virtue, so that she might please her heavenly spouse, whom she had promised to love and obey. Hence, if she were calumniated, she bore the calumny with patience. If she were ill-treated, she suffered the ill-treatment with humility, and if she were insulted, she not only pardoned the insult, but also prayed to God for those who insulted her, without opening her lips to say a word in her own defense. So strict a watch did Saint Rita keep over her tongue, and so faithfully did she observe the rule of silence, that she lived apart from all human communication and spoke only when necessity or the good of her neighbor demanded it. When speaking during recreation time, Saint Rita never uttered an idle word, and if by chance she heard any of the nuns using words she considered frivolous, she would at once change the topic of conversation and speak with great unction and prudence of the wonderful love of Jesus Christ for his chosen brides, or of the holy rule they were bound by profession to follow and obey. Thus Saint Rita said to her sisters in religion what Saint Paul said to the Philippians, our conversation is in heaven. For she always spoke, not only of those things that incline one to think of heaven, but she also conversed interiorly with the citizens of heaven, and that this interior conversation might suffer little or no interruption. Saint Rita was such a lover of silence that she carried always, in her mouth, a little stone to prevent the movement of her tongue, so that she could not offend against silence even inadvertently. Her great humility aided also to help her keep silence, for it prevented her often from engaging in conversation with the nuns when they were assembled in the recreation room. Saint Rita was indeed humble, and she had so low a conception of her merits that she looked upon herself as not worthy to be a servant, much less a companion of the other nuns. And to adorn and embellish the rich jewel of her profound humility, she took the greatest care to conceal, as adroitly as she could, the singular graces and favors God bestowed upon her, lest vanity would destroy their merits, or human praise or honors would make her proud. But the more the humility of Saint Rita sought to hide the splendor of her virtues, the more they shone in the house of God for the benefit of the people. For having placed Saint Rita, so to speak, in the candelabra of his church to shine in them, as the splendor of her virtues shone in heaven, God was pleased to make manifest her virtues and sanctity to the entire world, so that all who stood in need of spiritual succor, as well as aid and assistance in temporal difficulties, might have recourse to her powerful intercession. The fame of Saint Rita's virtues and sanctity having gone outside the convent of the Maddalena, and even beyond the limits of the province of Umbria, multitudes came to Cascia to seek advice and the aid of her prayers. And though she would have preferred to remain in the solitude of her convent cell than to engage in human conversation, or have any intercourse with seculars, her great zeal in the service of God and her charity towards her neighbor prompted her to meet and receive every class and condition of peoples. Some sought her prayers for the benefit of their health, some solicited her advice in their temporal affairs, some who had grown indifferent in their faith sought her instruction, and others, with tears in their eyes and on bended knees, urged her to plead with God to deliver them from their sufferings and afflictions. Very few of the very many who had recourse to Saint Rita were disappointed. Many sick persons were restored to perfect health. Temporal difficulties were solved through her prudent advice. Minds were reconciled. Peace was restored in warring families. Scores of indifferent persons were made zealous Christians by her instructions, and many sinners renounced their evil ways and were reconciled to God after Saint Rita had taught them the real value of a sincere act of contrition. There is no doubt the favors and graces that Saint Rita obtained from God for those who sought her aid were the effects of that wisdom and charity she possessed, for God had endowed her with infused knowledge, and many times when the spiritual welfare of her neighbor demanded it, she spoke eloquently of the mysteries of our holy faith. And blessed with that infused knowledge, she excelled, in a heroic degree, in the exercise of the theological virtues, as we are told in the decree of her beatification. The faith Saint Rita possessed and practiced was so fervent that, bringing into captivity every understanding, she was left free to advance in merit. And it was also a lively faith, as was manifest by the numberless good works she performed, and the learned instructions she gave to the ignorant concerning the mysteries of the faith. Saint Rita also possessed the virtue of hope in an eminent degree, and this virtue was so deeply rooted in her heart and filled it so much, that we are forced to say that her heart seemed to be too small a sphere for its greatness, for it overflowed, so to speak, to the lips which were constantly telling those who suffered afflictions and tribulations, "Have hope, trust in God, forget the things that are behind and stretch forth to those things that arc before." Saint Rita's charity had no limits but charity. She was all love. The love of God consumed her, and she was continually repeating these words of Saint John, words embodied in the rule of the great saint. Augustine, God is charity, and he that abideth in charity abideth in God, and God in him. Every work saint Rita performed was done according to the will of her divine spouse, Jesus Christ. At all times, in season and out of season, she was ready to succor and aid the weak and infirm, the poor and the needy, the afflicted and the sinner, knowing well that whatever she did for her suffering neighbor counted as done for Jesus Christ. Like all saints, Saint Rita had great devotion to Mary, the Immaculate Mother of God, whose virtue she tried to imitate, and every time she saw an image of the Mother of God, she was accustomed to say, "What an honor it is to have the Mother of Jesus for my mother." Saint Rita had also great devotion to Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament, and many times, while in chapel, meditating on that mystery of divine love, she was wrapped in ecstasy. Indeed, the Blessed Sacrament became her bread of life. And whenever she received our Lord in Holy Communion, for hours afterwards, she experienced such consolation and joy that she seemed to be no longer in the world, but to be living with Jesus. Out of time, we may say, and really a gift of God to her aged parents in answer to their prayers, Saint Rita began to pray in her earliest years. Sitting on the lap of her mother, she learned to pronounce the names of Jesus and Mary, and kneeling at her mother's knees, she learned the Our Father, the Hail Mary, and the Credo, that is the Apostles' Creed. As Saint Rita grew in years, her love for prayer grew more and more ardent, and we can safely say that every day and many times a day, during the years she remained in the world, the sweet voice of her prayers ascended to heaven and charmed and captivated the ears and the heart of God. But prayerful as Saint Rita was while in the world, it was when she left the world that she became the very soul of prayer and gave herself up to the contemplation and meditation of the divine mysteries of our holy faith. And because she desired to get closer and closer to her divine spouse, like Mary Magdalene, she spent hours at the feet of Jesus, absorbing the spiritual delights and graces which fell like heavenly dew on her pure and innocent soul. While meditating on the mystery of the Incarnation, astonished at the great humility of Jesus Christ in becoming man, Saint Rita often said to herself, "Why art thou proud, O dust and ashes? Dost thou forget that a God humiliated and annihilated himself, stooping from heaven to lift you thither?" The favorite meditation of Saint Rita was the pas scion of Jesus Christ, and she had so much compassion for the sufferings of her sweet Jesus that whenever she fixed her gaze on a crucifix, tears came into her eyes. When not otherwise engaged, Saint Rita could be found either in the chapel kneeling before the crucifix or in her little cell, where, as a memorial of the Passion, she had a few pictures attached to the wall representing some scenes of the sorrowful way of the cross. One of these pictures, as we have told you in another chapter, represented Mount Calvary. Fixing her eyes on this picture, Saint Rita contemplated all the many torments Jesus Christ had suffered. The heavy cross he had carried on his torn and mangled shoulders, the jibes, mockeries, and insults that had accompanied the stripping of his garments, the extreme pain caused by the nails driven through his hands and feet, and the mental agony of Jesus at the thought that all he suffered pierced also the tender and loving heart of his sorrowful and afflicted mother. Continuing her meditation of the other sufferings of Jesus, her heart would become sorrowful, her eyes fountains of tears, while from her lips would come forth sobs and sighs, messengers, so to speak, of the interior pain that she herself was suffering in her compassionate heart. Another picture, that hung on the walls of Saint Rita's cell, represented the Holy Sepulchre, where the sacred body of Jesus was placed after it was taken down from the cross. While gazing at this picture, Saint Rita had always the desire to die for the world and to be buried with Jesus Christ in God. Nor could she ever fix her eyes on this picture without saying, "Most sacred tomb, holy ark, celestial temple, that was worthy to receive the sacred body of the Son of God." It is related of Saint Rita that, on one occasion, while meditating before this picture, she was wrapped in ecstasy and remained so long unconscious to everyone and everything around her, that the nuns, when they discovered her, believed the soul of their holy and beloved companion had gone to a better and a happier life. Saint Rita spent a good part of the day and many hours of the night engaged in contemplation and meditation, and many a time did she feel a little displeased when the rising sun surprised her at meditation which she had begun at midnight, and she would say, "Why do you come so quickly? You wish to deprive me, with your small light, of the delights my soul is enjoying. Let me pray, O Son. I see me meditate. My soul sees more when it contemplates under the shadows of the night than my eyes do when aided by your splendor. Besides meditating on the mysteries of our holy faith, Saint Rita spent 2 hours each day petitioning heaven for favors and graces for her own soul and the spiritual and temporal good of her neighbor. She prayed to the Eternal Father and asked him pardon for her sins, by virtue of that extreme love that prompted him to deliver up to death his only Son, whose death delivered sinners from the death of sin. She prayed to the Son of God and asked him to enlighten her understanding, so that her heart might never stray away from I, who is the Revui, and the truth, and the life. She prayed to the Holy Ghost, whom she considered an ocean of love, and implored him to cultivate her soul with the dew of his love, so that her heart might become a nursery of both his fruits and his gifts. She also prayed to the Blessed Virgin and sought some of her superabundant humility to the angels for purity, and to all the saints, for a participation in the virtues they practiced in this world. By means of her continual and fervent prayers, Saint Rita obtained many singular favors and graces from heaven, not only for herself, but also for her neighbor, for so efficacious were her prayers that she obtained from God whatever she asked. We will cite 2 remarkable favors that were the results of Saint Rita's fervent prayers and powerful intercession. A young child, the daughter of a woman of Cascia, was sick unto death. The attending physician, and another who was called in consultation, confessed that medical science could not save the child's life. The poor mother, overcome with grief, hastened to the Maddalena convent and earnestly besought Saint Rita to ask God to spare the life of her only child. Moved by pity, Saint Rita spoke kindly to the sorrowful mother and consoled her by saying, "My good woman, have faith. God is good. Your child will not die. You will find her well when you return home." As soon as the woman had left her presence, Saint Rita hastened to the chapel and asked God to spare the life of the dying child. Her prayer was heard and answered immediately, and to the great joy of the afflicted mother, on her return home, she found her young daughter cured of her illness. The following is another proof of the intercessory power of Saint Rita's prayers. On one occasion there was brought to Saint Rita a woman who for many years was possessed of an evil spirit that tormented and maltreated her most cruelly. Saint Rita lost no time in showing her power over the infernal spirit. Raising her eyes to heaven, she offered a prayer. Then she made the sign of the cross on the head of the possessed, and she was liberated at once from the power of the evil tormentor, who, when leaving the body of the woman, uttered a loud and frightful shriek. The power of Saint Rita over the infernal spirits manifested itself many times, and especially while she was engaged in prayer and meditation. Time and again did the devil try to disturb her while she was at meditation, trying to frighten her with loud howls and shrieks, and even appearing to her under the most hideous of forms. But Saint Rita feared him not. She always drove him away with the sign of the cross and continued her meditation or prayers as if nothing had happened to disturb her. Saint Rita was also an example of prayer to her holy companions of the Maddalena, and very frequently did she urge them to obey faithfully the command of Jesus Christ, "Wati," and pray, saying to them, "My beloved sisters, since we offend our sweet Jesus, every day in thought, word, deed, and the omission of good works, we should pray every day, and every hour of the day, and weep for our offenses against so kind and loving a Father, Master and Spouse. Wing that prayer is both a spiritual nourishment of the soul and a celestial dew that fertilizes and prepares the soul to produce an abundant harvest of virtues." Saint Rita became full of ardent desires to taste of this sacred nectar, so that she might satisfy that burning thirst she suffered when she had become hydropical, so to speak, with the love of her divine spouse, Jesus Christ, and coveting to drink of the bitter waters of his passion, like Saint Augustine, her spiritual father and ours. Saint Rita considered Jesus Christ a sweet honeycomb, distributing sweet and delicious honey to all who seek him and follow him on the bitter way of the cross. She contemplated Jesus Christ, as the royal prophet had foretold, encircled by his executioners, who like bees surrounded him, in order that through him she might partake of the honey of redemption. She looked upon Jesus Christ as the miraculous dew that had fallen on the fleece in the time of Gideon, and considered it a foreshadow of his most holy incarnation, and considered, as did Saint Chrysologus, that Jesus Christ was tormented on the cross and his side pierced with a lance, so that a copious rain of blood and water might fall upon and sanctify a world of souls. And finally, keeping before her eyes the mysterious ladder she had seen, in a vision, she considered it a figure of the cross raised on Calvary, and actually desired to take upon her shoulders the cross, so that she might feel, at least some of the torments of the passion of her crucified Lord. The Lord heard the fervent prayers and anxious desire of Saint Rita, and looking with favor on Isla's faithful bride, he deigned to answer her prayers and grant her desire in a most miraculous manner. On one occasion there came to Cascia to preach in the church of Saint Mary, a Franciscan friar named Blessed James of Mount Brandon. This good father had a great reputation for learning and eloquence, and his words had the power of moving the most hardened hearts. As Saint Rita was desirous to hear so celebrated a preacher, she, accompanied by other nuns, went to the said church. The subject of Father James' sermon was the passion and death of Jesus Christ. With words, as if they were dictated by heaven, the eloquent Franciscan told the old story ever new of the great sufferings of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. But the dominant idea of all the Franciscan said seemed to be centered in the excessive sufferings caused by the crown of thorns. The words of the preacher penetrated deep lie into the soul of Saint Rita. They filled her heart to overflowing with sadness, tears were in her eyes, and she wept as if her sympathetic heart would break. When the sermon was over, Saint Rita returned to the convent carrying in her bosom every word Father James had said concerning the crown of thorns. After making a visit to the Blessed Sacrament, Saint Rita retired to a small private oratory in which today her body reposes, and like the wounded heart that she was, desirous of drinking of the waters of the Lord to slake the thirst of the sufferings she anxiously coveted, she prostrated herself at the foot of a crucifix and began to meditate on the pains our Savior suffered from the crown of thorns which penetrated deeply into his sacred temples, and, with the desire to suffer some of the pain her divine spouse suffered, she asked Jesus to give her at least one of the many thorns of the crown of thorns that tormented his sacred head, saying to him, "O my God and crucified Lord, O you who were innocent and without sin or crime, O you who have suffered so much for love of me, you have suffered arrest, buffeting, insults, a scourging, a crown of thorns, and finally a cruel death on the cross. Why do you wish that I, your unworthy servant, who was the cause of your sufferings and your pains, should have no share in your sufferings? Make me, O my sweet Jesus, a participant, if not of all of your passion, at least of a part of it. Recognizing my indignity and my unworthiness, I do not ask you to imprint on my body, as you did in the hearts of Saint Augustine and Saint Francis, the wounds that you still preserve as precious rubies in heaven. I do not ask you to stamp your holy cross as you did in the heart of Saint Monica, nor do I ask you to form in my heart the instruments of your passion, as you did in the heart of my holy sister Saint Clare of Montefalco. I only ask you for one of the 72 thorns which pierced your head and caused you so much pain, so that I may feel a part of the pain you felt. O my loving Savior, do not refuse me this favor. Do not deny me this grace. I will not leave here consoled if you send me away without so desired a pledge of your love." When Saint Rita had concluded her prayerful petition, her divine spouse, not wishing to resist any longer the desire of his faithful bride, granted her request, making of his crown of thorns, so to speak, a bow, and of one of the thorns, an arrow. Jesus tired it at the forehead of Saint Rita with such impetus and force that it penetrated the flesh and bone and remained fixed in the middle of the forehead, leaving a wound that lasted all her life. And even to this day, the sear of the wound remains plainly visible. The pain that followed when the thorn penetrated the forehead of Saint Rita was so acute and intense that she fell into a swoon, and she would have died then and there had not Jesus, who wounded her, preserved her life, so that she might feel, as she had earnestly desired, at least a part of the pains and torments of Isla's passion. On recovering herself, and knowing that she had been favored with a signal and precious token, Saint Rita returned fervent and heartfelt thanks to her divine lover and spouse. Saint Rita left the oratory bearing on her forehead the sacred wound, and on her countenance evident signs of intense suffering. On seeing the wound, the nuns were more than surprised, but they were ignorant of the mystery. Saint Rita, however, guardian of the royal secret, and knowing how important it was to conceal the sacrament the sovereign king had confided to her, hid it in her bosom and revealed it to no one. The pain caused by the wound increased day by day, and the wound itself assumed so ugly and revolting an appearance. That saint. Rita became an object of nausea to some of the nuns, who could not bear even to look at her. Not wishing to be the cause of the least inconvenience to the nuns, saint, Rita remained nearly all the time in her cell engaged in divine contemplation and glorying, even in the midst of the pains of the wound caused by an arrow of divine love. Sometimes the nuns visited her in her cell, either to bring her some nourishment or to speak a few words with her, for they all loved her dearly. And as often as they came, they departed edified by her wonderful patience. But Saint Rita was happy, even in the midst of her sufferings, and when she felt that her sufferings were becoming more intense, she said to her divine spouse, "O loving Jesus, increase my patience according as my sufferings increase." This prayer, like all the prayers of Saint Rita, was answered, and so great was her patience amidst all the pain she suffered, that she called the little worms which were generated by the putrid humor of her wound her angels, for they increased her sufferings whenever they moved or fed themselves on her tender and aching flesh, thus giving her new occasions to practice patience and to merit more and more the love and esteem of her divine spouse, Jesus Christ. We have already observed in another chapter, the Sovereign Pontiff, Pope Nicholas V, had proclaimed the year of our Lord 1450, Jubilee year. And knowing that some of the nuns of her convent were preparing to make the journey to the eternal city, to gain the treasure of indulgences granted by the Church on such solemn occasions, Saint Rita desired also to go to Rome, for, in her great humility, she believed that she stood more in need of the graces of the Jubilee than did her sister nuns. With her heart full of holy desire, Saint Rita went to the cell of the Superioress, and prostrating herself at her feet, humbly asked permission to go to Rome with the other nuns. The Superioress, gazing at the ugly wound on Saint Rita's forehead, judged that she had sufficient reason to refuse Saint Rita's request, for she believed that the very sight of the wound would be the cause of scandal to all who might see it, since the wound was on that part of the forehead which could not be covered or concealed. Hence the Superioress felt herself justified in withholding her permission if the wound did not heal, and dismissed Saint Rita with these words, "Be resigned and consoled. God will accept your good and worthy desire and will reward you." Saint Rita heard with profound submission the words of her Superioress, and recognizing that the wound, being incurable, would without doubt prevent her from going to Rome with her sisters, she hastened at once to her divine spouse, as to the only refuge in all her necessities, and kneeling at his sacred feet spoke to him, as never before spoke a bride to her bridegroom. "O my most sweet Jesus, crucified for love of me, you know it has always been my desire to serve you, though through negligence I have not served you as I ought, nor have I loved you as I should, vile creature that I am, and the beneficiary of numberless favors and graces from your generous hands. Notwithstanding my unworthiness, O my sweet Jesus, grant me the request I am about to ask. I desire to go to Rome to enjoy those spiritual gifts and blessings which your vicar grants to all the faithful with liberal hands during the Jubilee. Do not deprive me of that great treasure which is the price of your most precious blood and most sacred passion, a memorial of which you deigned to place on the forehead of your unworthy servant by means of one of the sharp thorns that penetrated your sacred head. You know with what patience I bear my wound. You know the joy I feel, because I have been wounded by one of the instruments of your passion. And you know the thanks I give you continually for having deigned to make me a sharer of a small portion of your passion. I do not dare to implore you to take away my wound so that I may go to Rome. I would, indeed, be ungrateful if I wished to return to you that sacred gift your loving and liberal generosity has given me. I resign my will to your holy will. I wish to conform myself to your sacred desires. Even if you heal my wound, one, do not ask you to relieve me of the pains I suffer. I ask you rather to permit the pains to remain, so that I may suffer interiorly, though you take away the exterior wound while I will be outside my convent." The humble request was pleasing to the Lord, and as it was his will that Saint Rita should make the pilgrimage to Rome, he healed her wound at once. Saint Rita, observing that the wound of her forehead had disappeared, gave thanks to God for so signal a favor, and leaving the oratory, she returned to the cell of the Superioress. Words cannot express the surprise and astonishment of the Superioress and the nuns at beholding so sudden a cure, and they confessed that only the medicine of God, applied by the angel Raphael, could have accomplished the healing of such an ugly and loathful a wound. There was now nothing to prevent Saint Rita from making the journey to Rome with the other nuns. The superioress granted willingly and gladly the permission, and said kindly to Saint Rita, "Sister, whom man ignorance can never prevail again the divine disposition." Accordingly, the nuns of the Maddalena started on their journey to Rome, delighted that Saint Rita was to be of their number, and though they were provided with some means for the journey, the means were insufficient, hence Saint Rita took it upon herself to solicit alms along the way. The holy and humble nun did this, not only because she was a lover of evangelical poverty, but also because she wished to exercise the function of a beggar for the sake of her divine spouse Jesus Christ. To some of the nuns who did not look with favor at her asking alms of the passers-by, she said with humility, by begging, "I am acting in accordance with the state I profess, and I also give my neighbor the occasion of exercising charity and of meriting an eternal reward in heaven." As a reward for the sincerity with which Saint Rita despised earthly riches, God made use of the following incident to enhance her heroic poverty and her absolute confidence in His providence. One day, when the nuns were actually without a cent to buy food or pay for a lodging place for the night, Saint Rita happened to see a gold coin on the roadside as she walked along. Stooping down, she picked up the money and gave thanks to God for the golden gift. But Saint Rita, who confided in the providence of God which prompted the alms of the charitable, threw the money into a river. All the nuns were surprised at what she had done. Some of them scolded her, while others even said she had committed a sinful act, considering their needy circumstances, and they added that the money had been sent by God to aid them in their need. When Saint Rita and the other nuns arrived in Rome, they visited together the station churches prescribed to be visited, and prayed with great devotion and attention to gain the indulgence of the Jubilee. The great devotion and piety manifested by Saint Rita as she went from station to station was very noticeable, not only to her sister nuns, but also to thousands of pilgrims, many of whom cried out in admiration that Augustinian nun is an angel on earth. After having visited the sepulchres of the martyrs and other places of holy interest in the city of Saint Rita returned to her convent with the other nuns, who, edified by her singular piety during all the time of the pilgrimage, gave thanks to God for having given them such a holy companion and for the happiness they felt in returning to their convent. Especially were the poor and afflicted of Cascia rejoiced, and they also thanked God when they heard the glad and good news that their beloved Sister Rita had returned from Rome. Not one of the nuns felt happier than Saint Rita did in returning to her beloved Maddalena, and as she stood on the steps of the convent before she entered, a singular joy filled her heart. Her pale face became flushed with heavenly gladness as she stepped across the threshold, and, at that very moment, the old wound of her forehead became visible, and she began to suffer intense pains. Naturally, the nuns were surprised at seeing the disfigured forehead of Saint Rita, but they recognized, with tears in their eyes, that the renewal of the old wound was in reality a gift of God, and that He had healed it so that Saint Rita might make the journey to Rome. Aiding from that day, Saint Rita's life was, so to speak, a passion. She suffered continually the most acute and excruciating pains, which were augmented not only by the strong offensive odor that came from the wound, but also by the little worms which dwelt in the wound. Saint Rita suffered all with unspeakable patience, and whenever any of the little worms would fall to the floor, she would pick them up with care and replace them in the wound, so that she might suffer more and more in memory of her thorn-crowned spouse who had suffered so much for her. Saint Rita suffered with much joy the torments the little worms caused, and one day, being asked what were those little worms that appeared in her wound, she responded with a smile, saying, "They are my little angels." She called them thus because they were instruments for testing her patience, and they reminded her constantly of the torment the crown of thorns caused her loving Jesus. Saint Rita had to retire and live again in the solitude of her cell to avoid inconveniencing the other nuns with the sight of the wound. Her solitary life increased the already rich treasure of her merits. She continued her penitential exercises, prayers, and meditation until the time came when she left this vale of tears, after having suffered a continuous martyrdom for 15 years, as appears from the process of her beatification. 4 years after her return from Rome, Saint Rita suffered more pain from the wound on her forehead than before she made the journey to Rome, so that her life became really a martyrdom. Moved with compassion for her suffering, or pleased with her wonderful patience, the Son of God came from heaven to visit and console her with his divine presence. This divine visit filled the soul of Saint Rita with extreme delight and gratification, and her heart was so consumed by the words of her divine spouse that, having sunk her understanding in the extreme bliss she enjoyed from gazing on the divine beauty of Jesus, she would have broken the earthly bonds that detained her soul in the prison of her body, to enjoy forever the happiness she saw, were she permitted to do so. Saint Rita gazed attentively at her beloved spouse, who, like a flower from the heavenly paradise and a lily from the celestial valleys, invited her to satisfy her thirst and fill her heart with delights by enjoying the sweetness his divine presence cast around her. But recognizing that the ocean of happiness in which she was engulfed was only temporal, and thirsting to enjoy the eternal, she ardently desired to follow her divine spouse, who disappeared from her view after he had given her a foretaste of what his chosen ones enjoy in heaven. After our Lord had disappeared, there remained in the heart of Saint Rita so deep a wound that she became so ill with divine love, suffering so violent an attack of fever, that she was obliged to betake herself to her poor and hard bed, whereon she lay, more dead than alive, without anyone knowing the cause of her illness. Thus for 4 long and weary years Saint Rita suffered the pains of love, in order that the gold of her patience might be refined, and that she might make a new ring, set with the most precious jewels, which she would wear at the celebration of her espousals with her divine Lord, when she made her entrance into the kingdom of his glory. Besides the pains of her illness, she suffered the torments of the wound on her forehead, and these torments were made more poignant by the continual movements of the little worms, which had also increased in number. But anxious to suffer more and more, Saint Rita bore every pain of her agony with the most admirable patience, and during all the year of her illness, she never uttered a single sigh or word of complaint, but respired rather, in all her actions, the celestial love that was consuming her heart with the flames of the divine fire. Having become ill with divine love, because her beloved spouse had left her after a short visit, Saint Rita experienced a love strong as death, which, however, did not take away her life but rather spared it, so that she actually suffered the pains and agony of death without dying. However, in the midst of all her afflictions, Saint Rita sought no human relief. Her chief delight was to feed her soul and body with the bread that came down from heaven, and to quench her thirst with the bitter chalice of the passion of her divine spouse, Jesus Christ. Thus for 4 years her life was really miraculous, nourished only by the body and blood of Jesus Christ, to show how dear Saint Rita was to her divine spouse, and to make manifest the fact that Saint Rita can obtain even the impossible from God if she ask it. Divine providence disposed her, while she was ill, to ask that a flower and 2 figs be brought her from the little garden which Saint Rita at one time owned and cultivated with her own hands, a garden which could be truly called the inheritance of God and the garden of her heavenly spouse, because she had sold it before entering the convent and had distributed the proceeds amongst his needy poor. One day in the month of January, a cousin of Saint Rita's came to the Maddalena convent to visit her. The visit was a short one, for that particular day Saint Rita was very ill and suffered much. On taking her leave, her relative asked Saint Rita if she could do any favor for her. "Yes, cousin," said the saint, "bring me a rose from the garden of my old home in Roccaporina." Saint Rita's request surprised her cousin, who thought that perhaps her mind was affected by her illness, and besides, as it was midwinter, and the climate of Roccaporina exceeding cold, her relative and the nuns who were in attendance could not be persuaded that the rose could be found. Nevertheless, to humor the saint, her cousin told her that she would try to fulfill the errand, though she thought it would be impossible. He defined what she asked for. "Saint," Rita responded, "my dear cousin, there is nothing impossible to God." The security with which Saint Rita spoke these words determined her cousin to set out at once for Roccaporina, and to her great astonishment and amazement, on entering the garden, she saw, on a sapless and leafless rosebush, a beautiful red rose in full bloom. She plucked the rose and returned to Cascia as quickly as possible and gave the rose to Saint Rita. The saint received the rose with great joy and gladness, and a heavenly smile lighted up her countenance as she kissed it reverently, while her heart gave thanks to God as she contemplated in that rose her sweet Jesus crowned with thorns. Saint Rita then handed the miraculous flower to the superioress, and from her hand it passed into the hands of all the nuns, who, after admiring its marvelous beauty, returned fervent thanks to God, who, to make manifest the sanctity of their beloved sister Rita, had caused a most beautiful rose to grow in the midst of a cold winter. To commemorate this miraculous event, roses are blessed each year in all the churches of the Augustinian order on the feast of Saint Rita and distributed to the faithful. Shortly after the miracle of the rose, God wrought another miracle at the request of Saint Rita. On the occasion of another visit to the convent, in the same month of January, Saint Rita asked her cousin to go and bring 2 figs she would find on a certain frozen fig tree in the garden at Rocca Perena. This time, without the least doubt in her mind, the woman hastened to bring the figs. She had no difficulty in finding the tree Saint Rita had described, and on it were 2 ripe and luscious figs. With no less joy than admiration at seeing this second miracle, she picked the figs and brought them to Saint Rita. Saint Rita received the figs with the greatest joy, and again did the nuns thank and praise God for having qualified, for the second time, the sanctity of their holy and beloved sister. But Saint Rita, elevating her spirit to a contemplation of the mysterious, considered the 2 miracles a warning that the time was near at hand when she would pass from this life to enjoy for all eternity the incorruptible flowers and seasoned fruits of the celestial paradise. Rita, knowing that the miracles of the figs and the rose were divine predictions of her coming death, she already seemed to hear the very same words that the divine bridegroom of the canticles spoke lovingly to his spouse: "Arise, make haste, my love, my dove, my beautiful one, and come. For winter is now past, the flowers have appeared, and the fig tree hath put forth her green figs. Show me thy face, and let thy voice sound in my ears. For thy voice is sweet, and thy face comely." Saint Rita considered these words as spoken to herself, because from the day she saw the beautiful and marvelous rose and the ripe figs, she was certain that the time was near when the mortal bonds that bound her to this life would be burst asunder, and she would leave this valley of sorrow and tears to go to enjoy forever that life and that happiness which she most ardently desired with her divine spouse and master Jesus Christ. To make Saint Rita sure and certain of her near departure from this world, and to invite her to the joys and delights of the celestial paradise, Jesus Christ, accompanied by his blessed mother, appeared to Saint Rita a short time before her death, and thus said to her, "I am your celestial spouse, who kindled in your heart the fire of divine love, and filled your soul with virtues, in accordance with your ardent desires. I am now come to tell you glad and joyful news. Rita, within a few days, you will depart from this world to enjoy an eternal rest in your celestial country." This visit of Jesus Christ and his most blessed mother filled Saint Rita's heart and soul with a flood of unspeakable joy. She knew now that the winter of her torments and sufferings was at an end, and that the gates of heaven were soon to be opened to receive her. A struggle was now going on between the body and soul of Saint Rita. Her body, though weakened and emaciated by fasting and penance, wished to retain the soul, and the soul wished to break the prison bars of the body to be with Christ, to whom Saint Rita was already united, so that she could cry out with the apostle Saint Paul, "And I live, now not I though detained in this valley of tears, but Christ liveth in me." Many and fervent were the heartfelt thanks that Saint Rita gave to Jesus for having favored her with divine praise. Hence, nor did she forget to thank the Blessed Virgin Mary, the sweet mother of her divine spouse, whom she loved with a most tender and ardent love. When the nuns of the Maddalena learned that Saint Rita had been favored with a vision of Jesus Christ and his most blessed mother, and that it had been revealed to her that she would soon leave them to be united with her divine spouse, who was their spouse also, they kneeled around her bed and gazed with tearful eyes on their beloved sister, whose face was radiant with heavenly joy, as she spoke these humble and tender words: "My dear superioress and sisters, the time is at hand when I must go to live with my beloved spouse. I may have offended you by not loving you enough, or by not being at times as obedient as our holy rule prescribes. I ask you to pardon all my faults against charity and obedience, and because I know that I have caused you some inconvenience and annoyance by reason of my prolonged infirmity, and in particular on account of the ugly wound that I have borne so long on my forehead, I ask you most humbly to have pity on my frailty, and if I have offended in anything, even involuntarily, pardon my ignorance, and pray to God for me, that your prayers may obtain for my soul that mercy and peace I hope from the divine clemency." The nuns, hearing the tender words of Saint Rita, wept bitterly at the very thought of losing her who had so often consoled them by her very presence and edified them by her holy example. Saint Rita, observing that the nuns were filled with sadness, consoled them by saying, "Sisters, I am not afraid to die. I know already what it is to die. It is to close the eyes to the world and open them to God." Saint Rita then asked to receive the last sacraments, and having confessed, the while shedding abundant tears, she was anointed and received as viaticum the blessed sacrament of the Eucharist, which calmed, at once, the tempest of pains that she had suffered without intermission. From the time her forehead had been pierced by the sacred thorn, being consoled by the sacred iris of the divine clemency saint, Rita began to enjoy a total rest from the antecedent torments and to taste of the eternal delights in the contemplation of the riches and abundance of the home of God. Saint Rita was now knocking at the gates of heaven, asking her divine spouse to open them. She also implored the help of the Queen of Heaven, the ever-glorious Blessed Virgin Mary, of the angels, and the intercession of her three powerful protectors, Saint John the Baptist, Saint Augustine, and Saint Nicholas of Tolentine. She felt sure that these three saints were waiting to introduce her into the palace of eternal glory, as they had conducted her into the haven of religion. Realizing that her last hour had come, Saint Rita humbly asked the blessing of her superioress, wishing by this last act of submission to enhance the merits of her most perfect obedience. And because she had always loved her sisters in religion with a holy love, her affectionate heart prompted these parting words: "Love God above all things, His goodness being infinite and His beauty without comparison. You should keep always before your minds the great love He has for you as Father, Spouse, and Master. Love one another with a reciprocal chaste and holy love. Observe faithfully the rule you have professed, and venerate with a religious affection our great and holy Father Saint Augustine, who has pointed out to you by his rule the royal road to glory. Be obedient to Holy Mother Church and to your superioress, as you promised when you made your solemn profession." Having concluded this exhortation, Saint Rita blessed the nuns with the last words she was heard to utter on earth: "May God bless you, and may you always remain in holy peace and love with your beloved spouse, Jesus Christ." Then, fixing her eyes on the crucifix, Saint Rita's soul took flight from this world to an eternal rest in the arms of her divine bridegroom, Jesus Christ. At the very moment Saint Rita expired, one of the nuns saw her soul being borne to heaven by angels. Sister Saint Rita died during the reign of Pope Callistus III, on the 22nd day of May, in the year of our Lord 1457. She had reached the mature age of 76 years, of which 46 years she had been an Augustinian nun.